primary debate. Presidential candidates take questions from reporters and from one another in a key primary state. From the Orpheum Theater in downtown Phoenix, here now is the moderator, Judy Woodruff.
Thank you for joining us. Tonight, we hope to give voters here in Arizona and all across the nation their best opportunity yet to compare the 6 Republican candidates for president and their specific views on the issues. We are in the spectacular 70-year-old Orpheum Theater. Built for vaudeville performances and movies, it is now a performing arts center. More than 1,300 people are in the audience here. They were invited by the Arizona Republican Party. Now, there will be 3 parts to this debate. In the first part, I will question the candidates along with my colleagues, CNN's White House correspondent John King and CNN senior political correspondent Candy Crowley. Later, for the first time in this Republican presidential race, the candidates will have a chance to question one another, and they will give brief closing comments. Now, to the candidates. Former Reagan administration official Gary Bauer. Texas Governor George W. Bush. Senator Orrin Hatch. Senator John McCain, who is with us via satellite from Boston. Former diplomat Alan Keyes. And publisher Steve Forbes. Now, the candidates were introduced in the order in which they will take our questions based on a draw that was conducted earlier. My CNN colleagues and I will focus our questions on 3 issues which are important to the public and the presidency: raising and educating children, taxes and government spending, and international affairs and national security. Now, the candidates did not know until just now which issues would be addressed. They will be questioned individually on each of those topics and have 1 minute to respond. Now, Candy Crowley has the first question for Gary Bauer on the subject of raising and educating children.
Good evening, Mr. Bauer. There was another school shooting today, this time in Oklahoma. What I'd like to know is, on the first day of a Bauer administration, what is the first concrete step you would take to immediately make the nation's schools safer?
Well, Candy, we didn't get into this problem overnight, and we won't get out of it on one day of a new administration. For over 30 years in America, we've had a breakdown of basic values. We took God out of the schools. We had an erosion of reliable standards of right and wrong, the breakdown of the American family. I don't think this is a gun problem, as some would suggest. I think it's a problem of the heart and soul. You know, out of Columbine High School, Eric and Dylan came to school every day, and they were giving each other the Nazi salute in the hallway. Nobody said anything to them. Nobody sent them home. Nobody took them to the principal's office. But if a teacher at Columbine had hung up the 10 Commandments, she would have been in the principal's office the same day. So, Candy, as a start, when I'm president, there won't be any more Nazi salutes in the public schools, and it's going to be okay to hang up the 10 Commandments again.
Thank you, Mr. Bauer. John.
Governor Bush, while you echo the overwhelming majority of Republicans in saying that most education decisions should be made at the state and local level, you would mandate federal testing, cut off federal funds to schools that didn't make the grade, and tie other strings to the federal money that goes to the states. Isn't this very similar to the Clinton administration approach that so many Republicans, including many of your colleagues here, say is the wrong way for the federal government to be involved in education?
It's not even close to what President Clinton thinks. I've got a record of reform in the state of Texas, and I'm going to take that to the White House. I believe that if the federal government spends money, say on the poorest of the poor children, we need to ask a simple question. What are the results? What are the results? Are the children learning? And if they are, we ought to give bonuses to schools for the poorest of the poor. But if they're not, if the poorest of the poor remained in trapped schools, that money that would go to the school should go to the parent. So the parent gets to make a different choice. I don't believe in national testing. I believe that local folks ought to develop their own tests and their own standards, because I strongly believe in local control of schools. I also believe in charter schools. I believe in education savings accounts to give parents a $5,000 per year contribution to be able to save for their children. No, my plan says less power in Washington, not more.
Thank you, Governor. And once again, we would ask the audience to hold your applause. We know you all have favorites, and we like that, but we do. Senator Hatch, in that connection, you support voucher programs, which of course would provide government money for parents to send their children to the school of their choice. But even the most generous voucher program would only provide a fraction of what it costs to go to a private school. Doesn't this mean parents with limited means still won't have the ability to send their children to the best school?
Well, no, there are a lot of those vouchers that raise enough money. A lot of these private schools, a lot of these religious schools, a lot of the parochial schools, even some of the professional schools, sometimes they can take care of it for what the voucher will be, and many of these parents would pay the extra if they could. For instance, take the District of Columbia. There's a federal system, if you ever saw one. We spend $11,000 per pupil, and those kids are getting the worst education in the country. The federal government spends 7% of the money for education in this country and demands 50% of the paperwork, 49 million man-women hours. I have to say, the best thing we can do is provide a means where these kids in the inner city that are not getting a good education, their parents know they're not getting a good education, to walk. Now, if the monies aren't enough, we should raise them so that they can be enough. And I believe in that. I really believe that if we do that, the public schools themselves, Elaine and I send all of our kids to public schools. We went to public schools. We're proud of it. And public schools are great, but when they're not working, those kids ought to have a chance to walk, and the voucher system will give them that chance.
All right, Senator Hatch. Candy.
Senator McCain, welcome. You've said a number of times that no good teacher should be paid less than a bad senator. In January, senators will be making over $140,000 a year. Now, without getting into the question of whether there are any bad senators, how could you pay anything even close to that? Who would fund anything even close to that for the good teachers?
You know that I would never allege that there are any bad senators. I win Miss Congeniality every year, as you know, in the Senate. Look, Connie, they may not, Candy, they may not need as much money as $140,000 a year. Perhaps senators don't need as much as $140,000 a year. When we vote ourselves pay raises all the time, and the American worker is not making nearly the increases that we are, it's really wrong. But look, we need to test vouchers. We don't need to take the money from public education. We need to do away with corporate welfare, put that money so there'll be a test voucher program in the poorest school districts in every district in America. We shouldn't have any federal bureaucrat deciding whether money should go to the states or not. That's decided by Lisa Graham Keegan and the people that I trust in the state of Arizona to run our education, not the federal bureaucracy in Washington, and I'll keep them out of it. I'll give them money
Senator McCain, your
where it
time
belongs.
is up. All right, John King, the next question.
Ambassador Keyes, welcome. Is there not a contradiction in saying on the one hand that Washington should get so far out of the business of educating our children that you would abolish the Department of Education, yet saying on the other hand that you would use the bully pulpit of the presidency and federal legislation, if necessary, to push for more prayer in schools and for values and morals instruction?
Well, I don't see the contradiction at all. First of all, using the bully pulpit is not coercion. And I have never suggested that I would use federal leverage to force state and local officials to adopt any particular approach to prayer in schools. I have simply pointed out that since we took prayer out, we seem to have let violence and decline in. And I think we ought to draw those lessons. But I strongly favor one principle, letting the parents take over this process. With parents in the lead, we will know that the cooperation between home, school, and faith has been restored. So the money we spend on education should follow the choice of the parents, not the choice of educrats, bureaucrats, politicians, who unfortunately have been manipulating this process in their own career interests, not in the interests of our young people. And I think once we do that, these other questions are answered. If we're able to spend $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 a year in our government school system on an individual student, then it seems to me we should be able to let parents decide where that per capita spending is going to go. And that way every parent, rich or poor, will be able to make the right decisions for their child.
Thank you, Mr. Keyes. Mr. Forbes, while we're discussing children, 6 years ago, Congress passed a measure to give short, unpaid leave to parents of newborn children or adopted children. This has been very popular. At least 20 million Americans have taken advantage of this. Now, President Clinton proposes to expand this program by allowing states to use unemployment benefits to provide some paid time off for parents who otherwise couldn't afford to stop working. My question is, do low-income parents deserve this kind of time off with their families?
You're absolutely right, Judy. All parents deserve time, and all parents should have the opportunity to spend more time with their children. But credits from Washington, raiding unemployment funds, is not going to do the job. The real way you give parents freedom is first let them keep more of what they earn in the first place. They shouldn't have to have an accountant to figure out what tax credits they qualify for. They should have it in their paycheck. Also, too, I believe that, as Alan and others have pointed out, we need to have parents have control of the schools so that they can go to schools where schools can have flexibility in terms of the time the children spend there. So the combination of genuine tax reform, where parents can make quality of life decisions, allowing parents to choose schools that work best for their children, that's the way to move forward instead of micromanaging with credits from Washington, D.C. Trust us, not Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Forbes. Now let's focus on taxes and government spending. And for this round, we are going to reverse the order in which the candidates are questioned. Steve Forbes will take the first question from John King.
Mr. Forbes, look back at the past 7 years. We have 20 million new jobs, 4.1% unemployment, low inflation, more than a tripling of the stock market. Yet you have been critical, not only as many of your rivals here have been, of the incumbent president's economic stewardship, but also of the job performance of the Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan. What, in your view, has Mr. Greenspan done wrong? And if you were elected president, who would you nominate to replace him?
Well, first of all, the prosperity that we're enjoying today, those foundations were laid by Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s. Let's not forget that. And it was the Republicans who stopped some of the destructive nonsense of the Clinton-Gore administration that enabled us to enjoy the prosperity we have today. Concerning the Federal Reserve, as I've said before, Mr. Greenspan did a very good job in the early 1990s. But in the last couple of years, he's fallen for this crazy theory, John, that prosperity causes inflation. And so they're trying to slow the economy down by raising interest rates. Why? It's like going to a doctor. The doctor says, John, you're in great health, so we have to make you sick a little bit. It's a bizarre theory, and it's already wrought havoc in agriculture. It's going to hurt our economy, and in terms of replacement, there are a number of good people out there. Jack Kemp, the head of the Dallas Reserve Bank as well.
Thank you,
There are
Mr.
people
Forbes.
who understand it.
Thank you. Candy Crowley.
Mr. Keyes, under your plan to substitute a 23% national sales tax for the current federal income tax, a poor family could save all year to buy a bicycle for their child for Christmas and pay the same tax as a wealthy family does. So no matter how many items you set aside and make exempt from sales tax, isn't at the heart of it this kind of tax something that disproportionately hits the poor over the wealthy?
Can't possibly be. The present tax system, which allows you to escape taxation if you're wealthy enough to pay accountants and lawyers, is what disproportionately hits the poor and the working middle-class people of this country. Under my system, you don't pay taxes until you decide how to spend your own money. And when you take it to the store and decide how to spend it, if you can't afford to be heavily taxed right now, you will confine yourself to those goods that are not taxed, to those goods that are necessities of life. And yes, that's going to mean some sacrifices, but it puts the question of how you develop your wealth base back under your control. You don't have to beg politicians and bureaucrats to get back in control of your own hard-earned dollars. But it also means that if you're a working person, think about it. Before you have put bread in the mouths of your children, before you put a roof over the head of those children, before you put a stitch of clothes on their backs today, you pay the government. We're worse off than serfs. Serfs used to pay their masters after they were fed and clothed. We have to pay our master before we're fed and clothed. I think it's a travesty, and I think it's time we end it.
Thank you, Mr. Keyes. Now a question for Senator McCain. Another question on the working poor. Both Governor Bush's tax plan, Senator, which you have criticized as too costly, and your own plan, don't include the payroll tax. What do you say to the working poor of this country? For example, the single mother waitress earning $22,000 a year with 3 children, paying 15.3% of her income in a payroll tax. Shouldn't she share in our economic prosperity the same as those at the upper income level?
Absolutely. And that single mother pays more in income taxes, and when you count Social Security and Medicare, than rich Americans do, and we're going to fix it. And we also want to remove a penalty if she gets married. There's no reason why she should pay more in taxes if she gets married. And if she gets wealthy enough and works hard enough so that she accumulates a business or a farm, then she should be able to pass it on to her children without it being confiscated. And I believe that we need to look at the working poor and exactly the person you talked about and provide them with the kind of tax relief they may need, including expanding the 15% tax bracket up to about $70,000 a year. And this is a serious problem and one we've got to look at. There are terrible inequities in the tax code. Finally, we've got to get the special interests out of it so it's not 44,000 pages long and a nightmare for average citizens and a cornucopia of good deals for the special interests in Washington, D.C.
All right. Thank you, Senator McCain. John King.
Senator Hatch, like Mr. Keyes, you have spoken of scrapping the current income tax code and replacing it with a national sales tax, and you've said you're working on a plan. With just 7 weeks until the people of Iowa cast the first votes in this race, can you tell us tonight what that rate would be and what specific exemptions you would propose to deal with the criticism, as we've discussed, that such a tax could hurt the very poor people it's intended to help?
Look, I'm for any tax plan that will simplify this awful tax code. I'm on the Senate Finance Committee. I deal with these matters every day. And I've got to tell you, anybody in this room can be indicted for violations of the tax code because no two tax preparers in the IRS can prepare the same return. Now, I'd like to see something like Alan's talking about because then people can determine what they pay by the consumption that they make. We're certainly going to have to take care of the poor through some mechanism that they will not have to pay as much as others. Under our current system, the bottom 50% of the earned income people pay about 5% of the total income taxes. But Judy's right. They get hit on the other side with these very awful payroll taxes. If you're self-employed, it's 15-point-something%. You're looking at a fellow who is one of the 5 or less who actually convinced Ronald Reagan to cut marginal tax rates from 70% down to 28% by 1986. Also passed the Hatch-Lieberman bill to reduce capital gains rates from 28% down to 20%. I've actually done it. I've been there.
Thank
and that's
you,
what I'm
Senator
talking about.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy.
Governor Bush, let's suppose for the purposes of this question that the surpluses, the projected surpluses in your tax plan, fail to materialize in full or in part. What part of your tax package gets dropped first?
I refuse to accept the premise that surpluses are going to decline if I'm the president. I think they're going to increase because my plan will increase productivity by cutting marginal rates. John brought up an interesting point, and he said, or Judy's question to John was, how do we take care of people at the lower end of the economic ladder? It's important for the Republican nominee and the Republican Party to hear the cries of people who are on the outskirts of poverty. And that's why my tax plan drops the rates from 15% to 10% and allows for $1,000 per child credit for working people, and all people for that matter. It is a plan that cuts the rates by 50% on families of 4 who've got an income of $50,000. Republican Party is oftentimes associated with the big and the rich. We need to be associated with the working people. And I've laid out a plan to do that. I've also got a record of cutting taxes in the great state of Texas. More than nearly $3 billion of taxes returned to the people who work for a living in my state.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Governor. This question for Mr. Bauer, and we're still on the subject of fairness here. You and most of your Republican brethren advocate doing away with the inheritance tax or the estate tax, but doing that would cost the Treasury literally tens of billions of dollars a year and would benefit, as you know, only the top 1 or 2% income level in this country, the very richest people who inherit money. Now, it's understandable why you would want to eliminate this for the family farmer, for the small business person, but for the very wealthiest. How do you explain that to everyone else?
Well, Judy, based on a very basic idea, which is the money was already taxed once. What in the world, on what philosophy does the government get to say that they get another chunk of it when you're trying to give that money, the results of your hard work, onto your children and grandchildren? Double taxation has never been an American principle, and it shouldn't be a principle in this area, so I would do away with the estate tax. Judy, let me quickly address something else that you raised about basic fairness. I'm the only candidate here that has put on the table a 20% cut in the payroll tax. All of us know the current tax system isn't working. How we reform it matters. I've got a 16% flat tax. You keep your mortgage deduction. You keep charitable deductions. The first $20,000 is tax-free, and then what's left, you only pay 16 cents on the dollar on. Unfortunately, Governor Bush would keep basically the current system. Mr. Forbes gives his corporate friends a brand new write-off that will allow many of them to pay zero. That's just not fair.
All right, Mr. Bauer, thank you. Our next area of questioning, international affairs and national security. Reversing the order once again, we begin with Mr. Bauer and a question from John King.
Mr. Bauer, you opposed the U.S. military intervention in Kosovo on grounds, in your view, it was not in the vital interest of the United States. Just this past weekend, there have been fresh reports documenting a Serb campaign to cleanse Kosovo of its ethnic Albanian population. Based on what we've learned since the end of the conflict, do you still stand by the view that the United States should have done nothing?
John, this is a fundamental question, and Ronald Reagan used to talk about it at the White House all the time. Under what conditions does an American president put our sons and today our daughters in harm's way? I think that there are many things happening in the world that we don't like, but even a rich, powerful country like the United States will be bled dry if we try to intervene every place where our hearts have been touched. Horrible things are happening in Kosovo, but they're also happening in Indonesia and in many other places around the world. We can use leverage with trade. We can use leverage with our foreign aid. But at a time when we have gutted the American military, taking us from 18 divisions down to 10, taking us from a 650-ship Navy down to 300, it is foolish and imprudent to be sending our men everywhere when the national security of the United States is not at stake.
Thank you, Mr. Bauer. Governor Bush, while we are considering America's place in the world, you volunteered at last week's debate that you are now reading the biography of Dean Acheson. And my question is, what lessons do you take from the successes and the failures of Acheson and George Marshall during that critical period in U.S. history, and how would you apply that to a Bush international policy?
The lessons learned are that the United States must not retreat within our borders, that we must promote the peace. In order to promote the peace, we've got to have strong alliances. Alliances in Europe, alliances in the Far East. In order to promote the peace, I believe we ought to be a free trading nation in a free trading world, because free trade brings markets, and markets bring hope and prosperity. In order to keep the peace, the United States must be strong militarily. Speech I gave in the Citadel in South Carolina, I talked about the need to not only make sure the morale in today's military is high, but also to make sure that we reconfigure our military. You see, if we get to redefine how war is fought, we get to redefine how peace is kept. The lessons of Acheson and Marshall is that our nation's greatest export to the world has been, is, and always will be the incredible freedoms we understand in the great land called America.
Thank you, Governor. Candy.
Senator Hatch, the protests outside the World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle basically boil down to this, that cheaper overseas labor and less stringent labor and environmental laws put U.S. businesses and workers at a trade disadvantage. In a Hatch administration, would you require that environmental and labor provisions be put in trade agreements?
Well, as you can see, that whole process fell flat on its face because the president was injecting into these debates and into those negotiations matters that just caused it to collapse. And it's a tragedy for this whole world. First of all, WTO is very important. I'm for having China join WTO. Why? Because it will undermine the very same police state that exists there today. I was in China in the late 70s, early 80s. late 80s, early 90s, and late 90s. And I've got to tell you, the differences between the 70s and 80s and today is just stark, and that comes because of economics, of being brought into the world market, of being able to participate. To be honest with you, what they did is Frampton, one of the leaders in the Council of Economic Advisors, if I recall it correctly, said these people should have a role inside the negotiating room. And that's what caused the problem. The problem is we should negotiate in the best interest of the United States, and it ought to be free and open world trade.
Senator Hatch, thank you. John.
Senator McCain, tonight there is both an emotional and a diplomatic drama playing out about a 5-year-old boy from Cuba who lost his mother as they tried to enter the United States by water. The boy's father back in Cuba says he wants his son back. If you were president of the United States, what would you do?
I'd say to Mr. Castro, let his father come to the United States and enjoy peace and freedom and be reunited with his son. We don't want his son to grow up under communist tyranny. Let me talk about Dean Acheson a second. When Dean Acheson walked into Harry Truman's office in June of 1950 and said, North Korea has attacked South Korea, Harry Truman didn't take a poll. Harry Truman knew what we had to do. If he'd have taken a poll, maybe Americans wouldn't have let us go. This administration is poll-driven and not principle-driven. We didn't have to get into Kosovo. Once we stumbled into it, we had to win it. And the fact is that this administration has conducted a feckless photo-op foreign policy for which we will pay a very heavy price in American blood and treasure. You have to have a concept of what you want the world to look like, where our interests and our values lie, and how we are going to bring this world into the next century and call it, again, the American century.
Thank you, Senator McCain. Mr. Keyes, another Kosovo question. You have said that you thought the scale of Serb atrocities there was grossly overstated, and that what the U.S. did through NATO in intervening was more dangerous than what happened inside the province itself. My question is, there's this new report just out by a neutral organization that confirms an overwhelming, brutal Serb campaign to drive out 1 million Albanians from Kosovo. Do you still stand by your view that the U.S. through NATO should have stood by and done nothing?
I understand the report. It confirms an intention, ma'am. And it's not entirely clear to me we react in foreign policy to intentions. We've got to react to facts. And the facts that they have been established on the ground do not support all the reports that came out in the course of that war, and you and I know it. The Pentagon has said so. Others have said so. We have got to be very careful not to lower the threshold of intervention. It was the pretext of the abuse of minorities in Poland and elsewhere that Hitler used for his aggressions, that other conquerors have used for their aggressions. If we're to maintain the principle of non-aggression that has been the bedrock principle for which Americans have died, then we've got to be very careful not to set an example ourselves that allows an easy pretext to be out there in the world for would-be aggressors. It's going to cause far more trouble than the trouble we resolve, as we are discovering, I believe, right now in Kosovo.
Mr. Keyes. Candy.
Mr. Forbes, you have said that the Clinton administration has made promiscuous use of U.S. troops overseas. In a Forbes administration, what troops would you bring home from what countries?
Well, first of all, they didn't have to send in troops to Haiti. We tried that from 1915 to 1934. It didn't work then, didn't work today. In Somalia, it was one thing to get the food on the ground, quite another for Clinton and Gore to play social workers and try to remake that benighted country. That was a mistake. In Bosnia, we didn't have to put ground forces there. This is not hindsight. I wrote about it in the early 90s, that if we had real diplomacy, we could have avoided that disaster by making clear to Milosevic that his victims, intended victims, would have the means to defend themselves. That would have solved that crisis without putting our people there. And when finally the Croats and the Bosnian Muslims got arms in 94, 95, lo and behold, the aggressors were thrown out. We could have done the same thing in Kosovo. We do have very real interests in the world, Candy. We have it in Asia, we have them in Europe. But this throwing our forces around and then not having an exit strategy and not building up the military is a policy of disaster.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. Now we move to the second phase of this debate. The candidates will question one another. Every candidate will get to ask a question and to answer a question. Once again, a draw determined the order in which we will proceed. Mr. Bauer will lead off the first of 2 rounds of questioning. He may direct his question to any of the other 5 candidates. Now, once a candidate has been asked a question, he will not be eligible to be questioned again during that round. Each candidate will have 30 seconds to ask a question. The responding candidate will have 1 minute and 15 seconds to reply. Then, 15 seconds will be allotted each candidate to ask a follow-up to his initial question, and 45 seconds will be allowed for a response. Mr. Bauer.
Could you go over that one more time?
You all wanted it this way. Mr. Bauer, your first question, and to whom is it directed?
Well, my first question, Judy, is for Governor Bush, not surprisingly. Governor, I worked for Ronald Reagan for 8 years, and he never gave the Soviet Union most favored nation status. He always insisted on progress on human rights and national security. Our new challenge is China. They persecute their people, arrest those that practice their religion, forcible abortions, etc. And yet you've embraced the policy of Clinton and Gore. You want to give them most favored nation status and membership in the World Trade Organization. Why not follow a Reagan policy instead of a Clintonian policy?
Well, I appreciate that, but you know how to insult a guy if you say I follow the policies of Clinton and Gore. I don't. They believe in what's called a strategic partnership. I believe in redefining the relationship to one of competitor. But I believe competitors can find common ground. I think it's in our nation's best interest to open up Chinese markets to Arizona farm products, to Iowa farm products, to high-tech manufactured goods. It's in our best interest to sell to the Chinese. It's also in our best interests. It's also in our best interest to make sure that the entrepreneurial class in China flourishes. I think if we make China an enemy, they'll end up being an enemy. I think if we trade with China and trade with the entrepreneurial class and give people a breath of freedom, give them a taste of freedom, I think you'll be amazed, Gary, at how soon democracy will come. And so I also believe that, so therefore I believe China ought to be in the World Trade Organization. I also believe that Taiwan ought to be in the World Trade Organization. But let me make this clear to you and to the Chinese. I will enforce the Taiwan relations law if I'm the president. If the Chinese get aggressive with the Taiwanese, we'll help them defend themselves.
Thank you, Governor. Go ahead.
Governor, Governor, we would have never made the argument that you just made if we were talking about Nazi Germany. Is there no atrocity that you can think of? The labor camps doubling in their slave labor, a bigger crackdown, more priests disappearing in the middle of the night. Is there anything that would tell you to put trade on the back burner?
Gary, I agree with you that forced abortion is abhorrent. And I agree with you when leaders try to snuff out religion. But I think if we turn our back on China and isolate China, things will get worse. Imagine if the internet took hold in China. Imagine how freedom would spread. I told, in my earlier answer, I said our greatest export to the world has been, is, and always will be the incredible freedom we understand in America. And that's why it's important for us to trade with China to encourage the growth of an entrepreneurial class. It gets that taste of freedom. It gets that breath of freedom in the marketplace.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Mr. Bauer. Senator McCain, you have the next question, and to whom is it directed?
It's directed to Gary Bauer. Gary, as you know, I and a number of others have been struggling to give the government of this country back to the people. And that is our effort of some years now to enact campaign finance reform, to stop this incredible inundation of big money into American politics. When I was trying on the floor of the Senate last time to get this reform enacted, I asked for you to support this effort. I'm pleased that you responded in the affirmative. Will you continue to do that and join me in making this a big effort in this campaign and a major issue?
Well, Senator McCain, I want to commend you for what you've done on campaign finance reform. There's some nuances that I might disagree with, but on your overall point, I agree with you that large contributions from either big labor or big business to the two political parties are corrupting. It's one thing for somebody to donate $1,000 to one of us, which is the federal limit. But when a corporation or a union can write $1 million or a $2 million or a $5 million check to the Republican Party or to the Democratic Party, we all know that that buys access that no average American can meet. And so I will support your effort to fairly have campaign reform that gets at the special interest in both parties. I think we need to do it. And quite frankly, Senator, I'd have to say that on the China issue, which I just talked to Governor Bush about, that I think this is one of the things that's twisting our China policy. Instead of having our policy on our most deeply held values, we're allowing money, contributions from big corporations, and their desire for a fast buck in China to make us forget who we are. Trade with China is changing us more than it's changing China. So I will support you, Senator McCain.
Well, on that point, we'll never know how much money poured in from China and Indonesia into the Gore and Clinton campaign in 1996. On those lines, then will you commit with me as the nominee of the party to reject any soft money, any uncontrolled contributions to the Republican National Committee, our presidential campaign, or anything to do with this upcoming presidential campaign?
Absolutely, Senator. We disagree on a number of other things, but on this, I stand in agreement with you, and I look forward to working to a point where the American people will be able to put their cynicism about politics aside and reach the conclusion that they do have as much chance as any special interest group in Washington, D.C. to affect the outcome of these important debates.
Thank you, Mr. Bauer. Thank you, Senator McCain. The next question from Mr. Forbes, and to whom is it directed?
It's directed, Judy, to Senator McCain. Senator, we know with the George Bush's tax plan that he leaves the IRS unscathed. The 67,000 lobbyists in Washington, D.C., their gravy train continues. The marriage penalty for moms at home continues. And also, too, the capital gains tax remains untouched. Cutting that is key to a prosperous future. In New Hampshire, you indicated support for a flat tax, and I was wondering if you might put flesh on those bones and tell us what you have in mind for tax reform.
I thank you, Steve, and I want to thank you for your efforts on behalf of a flat tax. You struck a chord in American people, and I appreciate and admire what you've been doing. I think we've got to eliminate the marriage penalty, the earnings test, raise the 15% tax bracket, put a level of $5 million on the inheritance tax so that 90-some% of American families and farmers can pass on to their children their hard-earned earnings. But look, you and I know that this tax code is 44,000 pages long. It's an abomination. It's a cornucopia of good deal for the special interest, and it's a nightmare for American citizens. We've got to get rid of the special interest loopholes that are rife in this tax code, and that's the first step in cleaning it up to reach your goal of a simplified tax system. I appreciate your efforts, but until the day arrives when we remove the influence of the special interests which have made so many young Americans cynical and even alienated from the political process, we're not going to be able to achieve your goal. But I look forward to joining you in it, and I applaud your efforts, and I thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Mr. Forbes.
Thank you, Senator. As a follow-up question, passing laws against lobbyists is sort of like passing laws against mosquitoes. Washington attracts mosquitoes. Washington attracts mosquitoes the way swamps attract mosquitoes. Special interests go there. Don't we need to drain the swamp first to get the mosquitoes out of the way? And don't we have to get rid of the tax code first?
If I may.
Senator McCain?
Yes. Steve, if I may steal a famous line, it's very much like bears going after honey. I don't know where I heard that before. But the fact is, if you want to drain the swamp, you take the big money away from the big-time K Street lobbyists, and that way they lose their power and their influence. Look, anybody who wants a status quo in Washington, they don't want John McCain, because there ain't going to be the status quo when I'm president of the United States. You take away the big money, you're going to take away their power, and you're going to break that iron triangle of lobbyists, big money, and influence over the legislative process, which has so badly embarrassed so many of us, and it is the gateway to draining the swamp. And I thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Mr. Forbes. Governor Bush, you have the next question, and to whom does it go?
Senator Hatch. Let me start by this way. Hay muchos hispanos que viven en este estado. There's a lot of Hispanic Americans who live in this state. And there's a lot who live in my state as well, which is a reminder that our party must broaden our base. I've tried to use my compassionate conservative message to do just that in the state of Texas and all across the country. How do you intend to reach the growing number of Hispanics, and how do you intend to attract them to the Republican Party?
Well, first of all, I think Governor Bush, you deserve a lot of credit. You're one of the Republicans who really has reached out to women, minorities, especially Hispanics. You had a good black vote in the last election. The African Americans supported you well. I think that's one of the strongest things that you have going for you. I have to say you're not alone, however. Long before you became governor, I started the Hispanic Task Force in the United States Senate. We set up a task force of Hispanic leaders from all over America. We didn't care whether they were Democrats, Independents, Republicans, or what. We just picked the people that we thought were the best people who would come together and try and give us ways of incorporating the Hispanic community as well as the African American community and other minorities as well into the Republican Party. And we have a tremendously fine going organization doing that to this day. And so you and I agree. It's a pathetic party that isn't going out there and doing everything it possibly can to win over women and minorities. And I've got to admit, I offered to do this in the last presidential election, to go to all the southern states. I was asked, and border states with regard to Hispanics, I was asked to go one time. And I've got to tell you, we've got to do a better job this time. We're going to win that vote this next time, and it's going to be because of people like you, people like me, we're going to win it.
One of the things that I found in my state, particularly when I focused on education, is that when I announced we were going to abolish a social promotion in Texas schools, which is a system that's got such low hopes and low expectations, that minority parents said, "Thank you, Governor, thank you." You got any comments on?
Well, I think minority parents owe you, and I think Republicans owe you. You've been a great governor. My only problem with you, Governor, is that you've only had formed going into your 5th year of governorship in a constitutionally weak governorship. And frankly, I really believe that you need more experience before you become President of the United States. That's why I'm thinking of you as a vice presidential candidate. Because if you had, just think, Ronald Reagan picked your father because he had foreign policy experience. Somebody suggested the other day, you should pick me because I have foreign policy experience. They got it all wrong. I should be president, you should have 8 years with me, and boy, you'll make a heck of a president after 8 years, I'll tell you.
Thank you, Senator Hatch.
I can only compliment
Governor
so
Bush, before you get carried away here. Mr. Keyes, you have the next question, and to whom is it directed?
I'd like to address my question to Mr. Forbes, because I know that you often say that you'd like to get rid of the IRS or the tax code and so forth and so on, but I'm slightly confused, because it does seem to me that what you propose is not that we strike off the chains of tax slavery, but that we equalize them. In which case, we will still have to have an agency. I guess we could call it the happy-faced enforcer of equal tax serfdom. But it would still be there. It would still be there. It would still be enforcing an invasive tax that would require that people tell the government what the government oughtn't to know. How do you abolish the IRS if you don't get rid of the income tax?
Well, Alan, whatever tax you have, whether it's the flat tax or a national sales tax, you are going to have a collection agency to make sure the money comes in. The virtue of the flat tax is, since you can do it on a single page, since it's simple, you don't need 110,000 agents to do it. You just need a handful to take in the paper, make sure the checks are attached, that they clear, and the job is done. The first, and for tax serfdom, under my tax plan, the first $36,000 of income of a family of 4 is free of federal income tax. And you don't need an accountant to figure out what credits you qualify for. Also, too, there's no tax on your pension benefits. You already paid the tax. No tax on Social Security benefits, and no death taxes. You should be allowed to leave the world unmolested by the IRS. As I pointed out, this helps real working people. A family in New Hampshire, the Daly family, mom, dad, 3 kids, they own a fish market. They figured they'd save enough money under the flat tax to be able to afford family health insurance. Real savings for real working Americans.
Follow-up.
But I think part of the problem is that since folks would still be subject under your plan to an income tax, when they wanted to give themselves, when they wanted a tax cut, they'd still have to beg their politicians. I mean, under a sales tax system, they give themselves a tax cut by changing their pattern of consumption. So if we really want to give people control of their money, shouldn't we just abolish the income tax?
Well, I think if you abolish it for lower-income Americans, yes, that's absolutely true, and that's what I do. And as for the national sales tax, you know, either a flat tax or national sales tax would be much better than what we have today. But there are challenges for a national sales tax. Depending on what you choose to exempt, the rate can be 20 to 35%. So a kid comes and cuts your lawn, you owe a 35% tax. You send your kid to college, pay tuition, 35% tax. That's a real burden on people. You buy a new house, 35% tax. And also, too, you better make sure you repeal the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which enables after the income tax, you're going to have both an income tax and a sales tax. And as for those IRS agents, I will support job retraining. I'm compassionate.
Senator Hatch, your question goes to?
Alan Keyes. You're all that's left, Alan. You're plenty, though, I'll tell you. You're great. Last week in New Hampshire, I proposed that all 6 of us leave our handlers behind, get on the same bus, and campaign from town to town through New Hampshire for a week, through Iowa for a week, and I'd be willing to amend that to include, of course, Arizona for a week. I think this format will prove more valuable to the American people in picking the best Republican nominee for president. Of course, this will only work if all 6 of us agree to participate. Now, don't you think it's time we stop electing the best campaign and start electing the best candidates? What do you think about that?
Well, as I said at the time, Senator, I think it'd be a wonderful idea because I think that the American people deserve to see the person that is actually going to occupy that office and who will be making the decisions. People can say all they like that you elect this team or that team. We are forgetting, aren't we, the old story of the loneliness of the presidency. The loneliness of executive power is not a joke. There are times when it all comes down to you, to your experience, to your knowledge, to your understanding of the principles. If you can't stand on your own 2 feet, if you're always looking for somebody else to put words into your mouth, then at that critical moment of decision, who's going to take the place of the one who should be making the judgment? I think it is time that we put something in place in our political system that will allow folks to see individuals apart from all the folks who are their support, apart from the people who put fancy words in their mouth, and instead see how they think, what they think, and why over a period of time that would give them a chance to understand how people can really perform when they're on their own. I'm not afraid of that test. I've got to tell you, I'm not sure everybody else in this race can say that, but I think they'll be proving it if they accept your position and go out there and instead of running on their name or their wealth, let's see them run on their abilities as I'm doing. And if they can get as far as I have gotten, then maybe they deserve to go farther.
Amen. What do you think? What do you think the voters of Arizona, Iowa, and New Hampshire should do about a candidate who is not willing to forego the scripted campaign appearances and campaign directly like this to the people?
Well, I've got to tell you, Senator, far be it from me to try to dictate to the people of Arizona, Iowa, New Hampshire, the rest of the country. I will leave it in their capable hands, but I will say this. Sometimes we treat this whole election business as if it's about what we do for voters. And my friends, that is not true. It is about what the voters of this country are going to do for America. Whether they're going to have the good sense to make judgments that will be good not only for your selfish purposes, but for the purpose of perpetuating this nation's liberty and prosperity and justice so that our children and their children can enjoy it. The Constitution says, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And that means that when you go into that voting booth, you're not just voting for yourself. You've got to vote for the future of this country.
Thank you, Mr. Keyes and Senator Hatch. And now we go to the second round of candidate-to-candidate questions. This time, Mr. Forbes will lead off and tell us to whom your question is directed.
This will surprise you, Judy. It goes to George Bush. We know that Texas is the second largest state in the Union, that it is the 11th largest economy in the world.
That's good.
It's also first in the nation in oil production. OPEC in recent months has been jacking up prices by withholding production. That means, of course, that consumers and farmers are hurt because prices go up. New England's going to have a very expensive winter with heating oil. What would you do to get the price down again?
I would encourage exploration. I mean, it's a matter of supply and demand. I would I'd keep plans in place that say, to our drillers, we want you to continue exploring. I also have got great hope for the natural gas business. The natural gas business is immune to OPEC. The natural gas business is hemispheric in nature. The natural gas business is finally recovering from the foolish ways of the Jimmy Carter era when they tried to nationalize, in essence, the natural gas business with price fixing and demand. The demand for gas has finally come back, as you know, Mr. Forbes, and so I've got great hope.
You can call me Steve.
Let me finish. Excuse me.
You can call me Steve.
All right. I'll call you Steve. The natural gas business is coming back, and that's good. That's how we'll become less dependent.
As a follow-up question, that's very good for exploration. We need to open ANWR and the like. Also good for the future on natural gas. But right now, OPEC is putting the squeeze on. Oil prices have almost tripled in recent months. Again, what would you do now to get that price down now, not a few years from now? Also, too, how low would you get the price to go?
First of all, governments don't control the price of oil, at least in America, as you know. I did something in Texas that will have a near immediate effect, and that's decontrolled our electricity system to invite a different type of demand into the equation in Texas. In other words, you're focusing on the supply side. I think we need to wean ourselves off of foreign oil and rely upon other products. And in my state of Texas, we're doing that. We've got a huge demand for natural gas, which, as you know, is immune from OPEC and immune from overseas pricing controls.
Thank you.
Governor Bush, Mr. Forbes, thank you. All right, the next question from Governor Bush, and to whom does it go?
John McCain, Senator, as the governor of Texas and as the... What did he say? Call you Steve or John?
I prefer John.
Wherever you are out there.
Okay.
As the governor of Texas and as the, which is the 11th, if it were economy, as Steve mentioned, would be the 11th largest nation in the world. I have worked hard to encourage faith-based institutions and organizations to help people in need. I've laid out a specific program to do so should I become the president. What is your ideas on faith-based programs, and what specifically would you do to encourage their involvement?
I think you're on the right track, Governor or George or W or Bush. I think you're on the right track. I think it's important. I think that our charter schools in Arizona are a classic example of that. I walked into a charter school classroom in Phoenix. I hope you'll take time to visit it tomorrow. With Bill Bennett on the desk was the children's book of virtues. The teacher was teaching the virtue of the month, which happened to be the importance of telling the truth. We need to inject that in all of our charter schools and in schools all over America. I would provide the much-needed tax breaks that are necessary to encourage them. I would certainly make them part of any voucher program, a test voucher program, which, by the way, I would not take out of education funds. On the issue of this oil and gas, I'd direct your attention back to what's going on in Chechnya right now, because there's vast gas and oil reserves in Azerbaijan and Central Asia. If the Russians control the outlets of that and overthrow those governments, then you're not going to get access to that, and the price of oil is going to stay up, and the OPEC companies are going to keep it in their grip. I'd pay attention to what's happening in Chechnya, and I'd stop the Russians from doing what they're doing, and that way we can bring the price of oil down.
One of the things, John, that
Thank you.
that I've suggested is we allow non-itemizers to deduct charitable contributions off their income tax returns. Do you agree with that? And, well, I'd like your comments on that idea.
Sure, I agree with that. And I also agree with many of the other tax breaks and incentives that you have proposed, and I think they're important. Many, yours and mine are somewhat similar, but there's a big difference. I do not envision surpluses forever. Harry Truman used to say that he wanted a one-armed economist because they always say on the one hand and on the other hand. And the fact is that I don't know that we're going to have surpluses forever. That's why I take the money for tax breaks out of wasteful spending and corporate welfare. I hope that you would look at that way of addressing the issue of cutting the much heavy burden taxes of the American family. Thank you, George.
All right, thank you, Senator McCain, Governor Bush. Our next question comes from Mr. Bauer, and to whom does it go?
Judy, my question is for Steve Forbes, but Steve, I want to be honest with you. The question's actually from my mother back in Newport, Kentucky, and I promised that I'd ask you today. She hasn't had a lot of formal schooling, but she's got a lot of good old American common sense. And she's got some real problems with your Social Security ideas. In fact, she used the word scheme when she said something about it. She hears you say that current retirees will be able to keep all of their benefits. But then you turn around and say that current workers will be able to take half their money out for these accounts on Wall Street. Since current workers' money is what's paying current retirees,
Mr. Bauer, we need a question.
Aren't you trying to have it both ways?
Gary, you can reassure your mother, I'm glad you're a devoted son, but you can reassure your mother that if my plan had been in place 30 years ago, your mother today would have 2 to 3 times the benefits she enjoys. And why you'd want a system to stay in place that gives such a rotten return to the American people, that allows the politicians to waste that money, spend it, misuse it, so those benefits are in jeopardy in the future, it doesn't make any sense. And in terms of the future, we are a rich nation. We can afford, I've looked at the numbers, you can find it on my website, we can afford to keep the current system for those who are on it and those about to go on it. But I think we need an honest deal for the American people, for the American worker, where their money, instead of going in the hands of the grasping Washington politicians, instead that money, their tax dollars, would go to their own individual personal retirement account. That way it belongs to them, not Washington. That way they have a more secure retirement, a better retirement. They're better off, America is better off, and your mother would have been better off. So tell her in the future, mothers like your mother will have a better future.
Steve, I think you might have just said more than you wanted to. It sounded to me like you were saying that you think Social Security, when it was set up, was a mistake.
Where I grew up, the opposite, Gary.
Well, but you said 30 years ago we set up a system that had bad returns. Social Security kept the elderly in my neighborhood from living in poverty. Was it a good program or a bad program?
Gary, the concept is a sound one, helping people in their older years. The question is, how do you do it in a way that the politicians aren't always wrecking it and going back on promises so that we hear proposals about raising the retirement age? Under my plan, not only will you have more for retirement, but also you choose your retirement age. If you want to do it at 60, go ahead. If you want to work till you're 85, go ahead. It's in your hands, not the politicians. And in Washington, you know what they do with the money. They take it in, pay the benefits, and with the rest of the money, what do? They spend it. I've compared it. You heard the reference to bears. Bears love honey. Even if they promise not to eat it, you know they will. The politicians love money. They promise won't spend it, but you know they will. I want to do better by your mother than the old system did.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Forbes. Mr. Bauer, the next question comes from Mr. Keyes, and to whom is it directed?
I'd like to ask my question if I can. Can I still ask Gary a question? Has he been asked a question? Yes, I can.
Has Mr. Bauer been asked a question?
Not this round.
No, he has not.
I'd like to address my question to Gary. Because, Gary, I know that you and I agree that we should have a linkage policy and that countries like China shouldn't be in the World Trade Organization. But in light of the fact that the World Trade Organization is an unrepresentative body based on an illegitimate principle of government. It is not a body that contains entities that are based upon consent, and yet it could make decisions that affect the lives, jobs, and livelihood of Americans. Our Constitution says that our representative bodies are supposed to be composed of states based on Republican forms of government. Consent, not dictatorship, for any of them. How can you support our membership in the World Trade Organization without violating our constitutional liberties?
Well, Alan, as you know from some of our previous debates and discussions, I don't like bureaucrats that are out of the reach of the people. I don't like HMO bureaucrats. That's why I support a right to sue. I don't like Washington bureaucrats that are trying to run the schools. And I don't like WTO bureaucrats either. I think that when decisions are made that affect the way we live, that affect our jobs, that affect what we can do with investments and so forth, those decisions ought to be made by people that we can reach, that if we don't like what they've decided, we can get rid of them. And I believe that in the case of the WTO, it's a system out of control. I don't agree with the demonstrators in the street. I think they had a lot of hidden agendas. That was the left fighting battles of the 60s. But they were right about one thing. The WTO is not representative. It's an alliance between some third world countries and a lot of big corporations, and I think it's hurting American workers and American farmers.
Well, then to follow up, just to clarify the point, because I think this is terribly important. Because I don't agree with all their causes, but I thought what caused them to go into the streets was that the WTO is a violation of our principle of representative government. We have signed on to something that is destroying our constitutional sovereignty. Do you believe that we should, in fact, withdraw from such illegitimate arrangements until we have renegotiated them on a more constitutional basis?
I'll take a look at WTO, at GATT, at all those arrangements. I'll first look to see whether there are reforms that can be made so that we can encourage trade, because I believe that if the playing field is fair, American workers, American farmers can outcompete anybody in the world. But if I find, as I suspect I will with WTO, that the system is so broke that it can't be fixed, that we've got to start over from ground zero, as president, I'm prepared to do that in order to protect American workers and farmers.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bauer. Mr. Keyes. The next question comes from Senator McCain, and to whom is it directed?
Senator Hatch. Orrin, you and I have worked on a couple of very important pieces of legislation in the past few years. One of them is the Y2K Product Liability Reform Act, which was very important to keep us from experiencing a flood of litigation as a result of the year 2000. The other one was the Internet Tax Moratorium Act. As you know, this was stoutly resisted by governors, Republican governors as well. Don't you think we ought to make the Internet Tax Moratorium permanent?
Yeah, I really do. I really think that we ought to do it, because I think it's far overblown to think that the fact that people buy over the Internet is going to reduce Mainstream USA. I think Mainstream USA can compete very, very well. I mentioned last week that I asked my wife about that. I said, Elaine, what would you do if you could order everything right over the Internet and have it delivered right to your home? She said, I still want to go to the stores. I want to touch things. I want to look at them. I want to enjoy it. I think she's not alone. I think there are a lot of people out there. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be encouraging one of the most important innovations in the history of the world, and that's the Internet. And I'll tell you what I'm worried about. I'm worried about, like everybody up here, I think all my colleagues would agree, I'm worried about the almighty hand of the federal government coming in and oppressing the Internet and stifling innovation and creativity and the greatest really innovative approach we've had. Now look, as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I've been in the Senate for 23 years. I've had a lot of experience on a lot of these things. We handle in fact, I handle all of the intellectual property issues. I've got to tell you, they are some of the most important issues in our government and in our country today. And we want to keep government's mitts off as much as we can, and if we do, we'll reap the benefits from it.
Well, Orrin, as you know, there are many Republican governors that are seeking Internet taxation on the grounds that they're being deprived of revenues, when in fact it will adversely affect the entire e-commerce and, according to recent studies, as much as 24% impact on commerce and conducted over the Internet.
We need a question, Senator McCain.
McCain2000.com. How are we going to stop them, Orrin?
Well, I think you should go to OrrinHatch.com and learn how to become a skinny cat, because I'm asking 1 million people to give $36, and I'll win this campaign for you, and I'll make sure these things work. But let me just tell you this. The Internet is extremely important. My own governor, he's a very thoughtful, reflective person, and he's worried sick about Mainstream USA. I'm worried more sick about innovation, creativity, and forward looks. And I think we've got to continue to foster and augment the Internet as much as we can and allow these great companies almost a full sway to keep going. On the other hand, we'll have to look at it very carefully, and if we see there's some things where they have to be corrected, maybe we'll have to step in. But right now, I'm against it.
All right. Thank you, Senator Hatch. Thank you, Senator McCain. And the final question comes from Senator Hatch to Mr. Keyes.
Listen, I can't think of a better person I'd like to be stuck with, let me tell you. Alan, as you know, I've been very concerned about some of these campaign finance approaches. I have no question in my mind that we need to change the system that we have. But I think that the McCain-Feingold bill is unconstitutional because it bars the parties from participating and leaving CNN, everybody else, every public interest organization to use the same money to participate. And it seems to me it's just plain wrong. What do you think about it?
Well, I actually think that all of these approaches are wrong because they're based on a premise that I think is unconstitutional. If we have the right of free association, then I think we have the right to associate our money with the causes we believe in any amount that we think is necessary to get those causes to work.
Amen.
And for government to step in and for these politicians to be dictating what we can do under that rubric is a total violation of our constitutional rights, and I think we ought to abandon it. It turns out to be incumbency protection anyway. They will never devise a system that isn't in their own interest. Let's devise one that's in the interest of our freedom. More freedom, not less. Simple premises that we should have. Very simple ones. No dollar vote without a ballot vote. You understand that? If you can't walk into the voting booth and cast a vote, you should not be able to make a contribution. No corporate contributions, no union contributions, no contributions whatsoever from any entities that are not actual breathing voters who can go cast a vote. And when you cast that vote, it should be publicized right away. The whole world should know who's giving what to whom so that the voters can enforce the result, not some gaggle of politicians acting in their own interest. I think if we have that simple system of liberty based on our constitutional rights, then we will be able to exercise that liberty, and the people at the voting booth will decide what special interests should be driven out of politics by driving out the politicians who represent them.
Well, I believe that the best thing we can do is we do need reform, but it should be disclosure, disclosure, disclosure on the internet within 2 weeks of receipts and expenditures. What do you think of that idea? Because that's what we're doing at ornhatch.com, I'll tell you that.
That is exactly in line with the second point that I just made, because I think that at the end of the day, we should not try to have bureaucrats and other people enforcing this kind of political discipline. At the end of the day, it's up to us, the voters. But how can we do it if we don't have the information? And you know the information we need? We need to know who's giving what to whom. And rich folks who want to give a lot of money to candidates and causes they believe in, they should be forced, not behind packs and camouflage, but under their own names, right out into the political arena, into the heat and dust of the political fray. If they're willing to bear that kind of heat, then they can make their contributions. I have a feeling a lot of them won't be willing to bear it, though. And that will itself regulate participation of money in our politics. But at the end of the day, publicity tied with our informed voting is the best way to regulate this system.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Keyes, Senator Hatch. You all are having so much fun. We hate to stop this candidate-to-candidate questioning, but it is now time to move to the final phase of this debate when each candidate will have a minute for closing remarks, and we will begin with Mr. Bauer.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you all very much. If the next century is going to be an American century, we must be ready and prepared to deal with issues of the human heart. We must rebuild the American family so that fewer of our children cry themselves to sleep at night. We have to teach our children to reject the message of the culture that says if it feels good, do it, and instead teach them to temper their liberty with virtue. We have to reach racial reconciliation by reminding each other that we're brothers and sisters because we were all created by God. We have to have a foreign policy built on American values found in the Declaration of Independence, not just on somebody's corporate line. And most importantly, we need to set another place at the table, this time for our own flesh and blood, our unborn children who ought to be welcomed into the world and protected by the law. This is what the party of Abraham Lincoln and Ronald Reagan ought to stand for. And this is what I will fight for as President of the United States. Thank you very much.
Governor Bush.
I've asked my great wife and our girls to join me in this cause because I believe the American dream must touch every willing heart, must help those who work hard to achieve the dream. I've got a conservative agenda that will reduce the taxes not only to keep prosperity alive, but to help people who live on the outskirts of poverty. I believe we can keep the peace by keeping America militarily strong. I want to make sure every child is educated and no child is left behind. I've got a plan that will encourage faith-based organizations to help people in need. And I've got a plan to make sure our Social Security system is safe and secure. I will work hard to unite our party, put an optimistic face on our conservative philosophy. I believe when we match our conservative minds with our compassionate hearts, we will earn the confidence, the respect, and the votes of our fellow Americans. I'm asking for your vote. Thank you for your consideration, and God bless.
Thank you, Governor. Senator Hatch.
I have more experience in fighting for you than anybody up here, and certainly more than the two Democrats who are running as well. I have a record of accomplishment that I don't think can be matched. I have a reputation for bringing those diverse elements together in Washington and getting things done. Look, I wasn't born to wealth. We were dirt poor. We didn't even realize it until I got to high school. Then I realized it. I raised chickens and sold eggs as a young boy door to door. Learned a trade, became a member of the AFL-CIO, became a journeyman lather, worked in the building construction trade unions for 10 years. I want you to know I worked as a janitor when I went to college. It was humble work, but it was all I had. 65 cents an hour. I understand you. I've been fighting for you for 23 solid years, and I know how to do it. And I'm not just talking about it. I've done it. And let me just end by saying, we really need the leader of the free world to be a person of candor, honesty, intelligence, and ability. I want to serve you, and if you'll give me the chance, I guarantee I won't let you down.
Senator Hatch, thank you. Senator McCain.
I want to thank all my friends from Arizona who are there tonight. I've been honored to serve you, and you've elected me on 5 separate occasions with 70% of the vote last time. And I've tried to represent you according to the principles of Barry Goldwater and Morris Udall and other great Arizonans. I'm running for president because I want to reform government. I want to reform the tax code, which is 44,000 pages long. I want to reform the military so we can meet the post-Cold War challenges. I want to reform education so that every parent in America can have the choice of sending their child to the school of their choice. I can't do that unless we reform this broken campaign finance system. I commit to you till the last breath I draw. I will rid this country of the special interests which have deprived you of your interests in Washington. I promise you I will do that, and then I will be able to inspire a generation of Americans to commit themselves to causes greater than their self-interest. Please join me in this great crusade.
Thank you, Senator McCain. Mr. Keyes.
Thank you very much. You know, even in listening to the comments and things that have been made tonight, I guess I get a sense of some of the differences between myself and others who are up here. Because all of this business is standing in front of you and promising, I'm going to do this for you and that for you, and we're going to take care of the other thing for you in tax codes, everything. This is not what this country is about. We are supposed to take care of ourselves. And the government's a mere instrument for doing a few things that we do collectively when we can't take care of ourselves. That concept was the one it was founded on. And I think we're losing confidence in it because we're losing confidence in ourselves. And we're losing confidence in ourselves because we've allowed the basic moral principles that guarantee our conscience and integrity to be abandoned and betrayed. So I think our first priority is to restore allegiance to those principles by making it clear that we do not have the right to destroy innocent life in the womb because God is the source of those rights, not human choice. And if we respect that authority, then we reestablish the basis for moral conscience, moral discipline, and the kind of self-respect that is the true basis for confidence in our liberty.
Mr. Forbes.
Thank you very much, Judy. Thank all of you for being here tonight and participating in this process. The purpose of my campaign is to give new meaning to Lincoln's words at Gettysburg when when he talked about a new birth of freedom, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. We're on the cusp of a fabulous and extraordinary era, but we won't realize the extraordinary potentials that are out there, the possibilities, unless we have a break from the grip of politics as usual. Washington can't do it. Washington and the government is taking too much of your money, which is hurting the quality of life. We need a new birth of freedom for the freedom to be born, freedom from fear of the IRS, freedom for parents to choose schools that work for their children, freedom for young people to choose where their Social Security taxes are invested, freedom for parents to choose schools that work best, not only for their children, but their grandchildren as well. We can make these things happen, but I need your help. I'm one person. I can't do it alone. With your help, we will redeem the promise of America. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Thank you, Mr. Forbes. And with that, we conclude the CNN Election 2000 presentation. We want to thank first and foremost the candidates for your participation, your cooperation. We want to thank the people of Phoenix. We want to thank this audience. We want to thank the Arizona Republican Party. I am Judy Woodruff, and on behalf of my colleagues at CNN, in particular Candy Crowley and John King, all of us, thank you very much.
WHO-TV news anchor John Bachman and Tom Brokaw.
Good evening from Des Moines. In just 6 weeks, in the balmy closing days of January, out here in the nation's heartland, the good people of Iowa, hundreds of thousands of them, will gather in caucuses across the state, Democrats and Republicans alike. They'll gather in city halls and in churches and school buildings, also in kitchens. They'll discuss politics, and they'll decide who they'd like to have be their next president of the United States. And tonight, on this stage, for the first time in Iowa in this electoral season, we have all 6 of the Republican presidential candidates for what we know will be a spirited 90 minutes. John?
Well, the Iowa caucuses are a unique part of the American political process. And in more than 21 precincts, 2,100 precincts across our state, neighbors will gather to conduct party business, and as Tom said, to express their presidential preference. And because these are the first in the nation caucuses, their influence extends well beyond the Iowa borders, Tom.
And we're going to try to do something a little different tonight to engage all of you in this process, and with the cooperation of the candidates as well. We'll not have any bells or buzzers to signal the end of their time. We've asked them to confine their questions, their answers, to 1 minute, and any follow-up response to about 30 seconds. Now, there are no trapdoors beneath their seats, so if they go over that, we're going to have to find a way to cut them off and move on. And we're going to move through this tonight by not going just in auto rotation. We'll have questions for the various candidates. Everyone will get a fair shake at this evening, but we're not going to go in rote step.
We have some questions from viewers, and we will work them in throughout the course of the evening. The candidates will be able to ask one question of another candidate, and each candidate will have 60 seconds for a closing statement. And in the audience tonight are guests of the Iowa Republican Party and also guests of WHO-TV.
John, let's begin by introducing the people that we've all come here to hear tonight. Beginning at my left, Steve Forbes, the well-known publisher who is running for a second time here in Iowa. Alan Keyes, former Assistant Secretary of State and Ambassador. George W. Bush, the governor of the state of Texas.
Next to him, the senior U.S. Senator from Utah, Orrin Hatch. Also with us, the senior U.S. Senator from Arizona, John McCain, and former Reagan administration official, Gary Bauer. Tom?
Gentlemen, let's begin. Today, Time magazine, the newspapers, and television and radio were filled with the blood-chilling accounts of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold and the videotapes that they left behind before they engaged in that cold-blooded massacre at Columbine High School. In those videotapes, they invoke guns and video games and movies. Now, if past patterns are any guide, all 3 of those industries will disclaim any responsibility for what happened at Littleton High School. Senator McCain, first of all, welcome to Iowa.
Nice to be back.
Do you think that the gun industry, the video game industry, and Hollywood have any role in what happened at Columbine High?
Absolutely. And there's one other group of Americans, and that is families. Families and communities and neighborhoods, because that's where the responsibility begins and ends. But I've been saying for a long time, Tom, that it's not just the availability of guns, although obviously existing laws have to be enforced and we have to do other things such as pursue technology that only allows the owner of a gun to fire it. But we've all known that there's very pernicious influences that are being felt by our children. In these tapes you were describing, they talk about a specific video game and a specific character in that game. That should chill us all. We parents should know what our children are seeing. When Cindy and I come home, our kids are in their rooms on the internet. I can't tell you that I always know what my children are watching. I can't tell you exactly what they're seeing when they go to the mall. It's my responsibility. But I believe that when we're wiring every school and library in America to the internet, that each of those schools and libraries should have filtering software to filter out that stuff. About a year ago, there was a young boy in the Phoenix Library that was watching pornography at the Phoenix Library on the internet. He walked out and molested a 4-year-old boy. There is an influence. We need to know what it is, and we need to know why we're robbing our children of the most precious treasure, and that's their innocence.
Governor Bush, when your father became president, he promised the nation that he would try to have a kinder, gentler nation. And despite his best efforts, things are a lot worse off now than they were when he took office. Is there anything specifically that a president of the United States can do to interrupt what seems to be an evolving culture of violence and rage in America?
You know, one of the interesting parts of your question is that there's so much focus on the Dow Jones Industrial Average today, and that's fine. I mean, if you listen to folks in Washington, they think everything is great. There is a problem of heart in America. One of the great frustrations as being a governor is I wish I knew the law that make people love one another, because I'd sign it. But I do know that we can institute programs of faith and goodwill, that our society ought to welcome into mentoring programs and after-school programs people whose whole mission it is in life to change hearts, to love a neighbor in need. People who hear the universal call that I want to love a neighbor just like I want to be loved myself. And so, while there's a lot of focus on the economy, and that's fine, the next president of the United States must tap into the great strength of America, which are the hearts and souls of decent Americans. You see, that's where the greatness of America lies. It doesn't lie in the halls of government.
Ambassador, specifically, however, besides engaging in that kind of discussion and invoking those kinds of mottos, what do you think a president can do these days that would make a real difference in interrupting this culture of violence that is so prevalent in so many communities?
I think the first thing we have to do is restore this country's allegiance to its basic moral principles. We express great shock and outrage that we are bloodying the hallways of our schools with the blood of our children. What about the blood of our children killed in the womb on the basis of a doctrine that completely rejects the basic principles on which this nation was founded? If our rights come from God, then we ought to shape our children's consciences in the fear of God. And I think that what we're seeing in our schools is the direct result of our failure to respect that heritage and to pass it on. So the first thing I would want to do is get us back to that road with a Human Life Amendment that respects life and restores our respect for the will of God. Then let's turn those schools back over to responsible parents so that we can put faith and prayer back in the classroom, and the shaping of the conscience in the fear of God will then become once again the everyday business of our schools. I think we can clear up the void only by filling that void once again with the faith this country was founded on.
Senator Hatch, do you think that there's a direct connection between Roe versus Wade and the violence that we see in schools these days?
Sure do. There's an insensitivity to life in our society today. When you have 40 million babies that have been aborted since Roe versus Wade, there comes an insensitivity that affects all of us. But I'll tell you what I'd do. I think the first thing the President of the United States ought to do in order to try and change things is not expect from the American people something that he himself is not willing to do. I think the President of the United States ought to set a moral tone in this country and ought to do what's right. He ought to be a person of integrity and decency. When he goes to the movie industry, a person like this, and that's what I'd try to bring. When I go to the movie industry, and I go to the videotape industry, and I go to the music industry, I'll have a moral power to talk to those people
and say, look, let's get together. There's too much obscenity, pornography, violence, and crime in our society today, and it's about time you people started living up to your responsibilities as well. These young kids that have committed these murders, let me tell you something. One in particular mentioned that it was the videotape Doom, video game Doom, that he was playing. The kid in West Paducah, Kentucky. He had never shot a gun before, to my knowledge. He went in there and knew exactly what to do because he'd been playing these video games. They learn how to rape. They learn how to murder. They learn how to treat other human beings wrongfully. And I'll tell you, I've set an example. I think that's the first thing that the president can do and should do, and I think the American people will follow suit.
Thank you, Mr. Hatch. Mr. Bauer, you have talked about reshaping the morals of this nation. When Iowans think about morality, they turn to their churches and their synagogues for guidance. And here in Iowa, the mainline churches have talked about tighter gun control restrictions than really any of the 6 here. The top 3 churches in Iowa, the denominations, Roman Catholic, ELCA, and Methodist, all have statements on this. And the United Methodist calling for a ban on the possession and manufacture and sale of handguns. Are you asking to reshape the morals of the churches?
Well, I think the churches should leave to politicians discussions about the regulation of various industries. The churches ought to be talking about the human heart, about the soul of America. And I think part of the problem is that some so-called, as you put it, mainline churches are passing resolutions about gun control instead of asking the questions about what's happened in American society since that time so many years ago when the founding fathers said we were a shining city on a hill, that our liberty came from God. You know, the reference to Time magazine, Eric and Dylan were coming to school every day, and they were giving each other the Nazi salute in the hallway. The teachers thought that was part of their free speech to do that. But if a teacher at Columbine had come up to those kids and said, you know what, Eric, I know you're going through some problems, but God loves you. He has a place in the world for you. That teacher would have been in trouble. A president, let me just say one thing, a president can do something about this. He can put judges on the court that understand that our liberty comes from God, that he's the author of it, and that only a virtuous people can remain free. And that ultimately will be a lot more important than passing another gun law.
Are you saying to the churches, though, that gun control is not a moral issue?
No, I think gun control, who in America wants Eric and Dylan to have a gun? They violated 17 gun laws that day. The deeper question is, why did 2 American boys do to fellow human beings what it would be impossible to imagine an American child doing to cats or dogs? What did we do in America to so undermine the sanctity of life that we could raise a couple of kids with empty hearts? And I think part of it is that we undermine the sanctity of life by telling our children that they've got a constitutional right to take innocent human life if it's in their way.
Governor Bush, you are in favor of some gun controls. Do you hear the concerns of the churches on relating gun control to
I'm in favor of keeping guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them, like felons and juveniles. But I'm for enforcing the laws on the books. I think the churchmen here in Iowa ought to hear that if we enforce the laws on the books, if we send a clear signal to people that we're going to hold you accountable for breaking the law, that they'll realize society will be safer. In my state of Texas, we've done just that. We've armed DAs with extra money to prosecute people who break the law. There's a lot of laws on the books around the states and in the federal government. And we need to send a signal to people. Don't be illegally selling guns and don't be illegally using guns. I think the best accountability for somebody who breaks the law with a gun is called jail, certain jail. But I also know we need to have laws that keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. I mean, that's why, for instance, background checks. I think that's a system that, when properly employed, will work and work well. And that's the kind of law and that's the kind of president I'm going to be if I win the vote.
Mr. Forbes, I want to give you the opportunity to speak on both of these questions. Go all the way back to Tom and your response.
Well, obviously, it does begin with us as parents, as neighbors, as citizens, teaching our young people a strong sense of right and wrong. It also means giving parents choice to choose schools that they think are best for their children so they don't have to worry that what they're trying to teach at home is being undermined in school in terms of morals and values. And so that is a critical part of it, too. And enforcement sends a very strong message. The Clinton-Gore administration has been full of pious palaver about the need, about doing more about guns. But look what they've done. Prosecutions for crimes committed with firearms, federal crimes, way down. What message does that send? Felons who try to get guns, they won't let them buy the gun, but they don't prosecute them for trying to get the gun. So prosecutions are way down. You bring a gun to a school, John, and there's only one chance in 1,000 you're going to be prosecuted. What message does that send? So it also, as Gary and others have indicated and very forcefully said, it also gets back to life. And not just life in the womb, not just life as adolescents, but also life in the older years for the elderly and the infirm. And as a father of 5 daughters, my wife Sabina and I have been worried sick over the years of what the culture is doing and undermining what we're trying to teach at home. So it all combines together.
But you're saying to the mainline churches here in Iowa that they're wrong on this.
I'm saying to the mainline churches, you have a critical task in making sure, not making sure, but trying to inculcate with us a strong sense of right and wrong, that life is indeed a God-endowed right. If you believe that life is a state-created right or state-endowed right, then what you're saying is those who have the power determine who lives and who doesn't. And we've seen in this century the bloody consequences of not realizing there's a higher authority, that there is God, and that life emanates from God and God only.
So. Senator McCain, let's move on to health care if we can. Medicare, do you think it's broken?
Sure.
And what would you do about it?
Well, there's many facets of the Medicare problem, including the demographics of an aging baby boomer generation. We've got to have a place to start, and I think a great place to start would have been the commission that John Breaux and Senate Congressman Thomas headed, that had the best minds of America together, and they had a good blueprint for a way that we could begin to address this multifaceted issue. We could have this town hall meeting just about those. Let me talk to you about one issue that's come up in town hall meeting after town hall meeting that I've had, and that's prescription drugs for senior citizens. We're asking senior citizens now to make a choice between their health and their income. They make too much money to be on Medicare and not enough to obviously pay for these drugs. We've got to devise a program that when a senior spends a certain part of their income on these prescription drugs, that we'll have a state and federal match for it. We can't do that to our senior citizens. Another serious issue is 11 million children that are without health insurance. That we've got to expand the children's health insurance program. There's a variety of areas that we have to work on, Tom, because Medicare is probably the most difficult challenge that we faced in the next century, because it has a lot to do with other things besides money. And I'll tell you what, I have the guts to take the money where it shouldn't be spent in Washington and put it where it should be spent, including 10% of the surplus.
Senator Hatch, why not have means testing for Medicare? Why should someone who earns my kind of income, for example, pay and get the same kind of coverage as a school teacher or someone who works on a farm here in Iowa? Pick an investment banker and put them up against a cop. Why can't people who earn more money help make it possible for older Americans who have real need to get prescription drugs under their coverage?
Well, first of all, I don't think you're going to ask for Medicare with the amount of money you make. In fact, I think you could take care of all of us right up here on the desk with what you make. And maybe everybody in the audience as well. You never know. Let me just say this. There are 40 million people on Medicare. By 2035, there will be 80 million people on Medicare. Medicare's in trouble. This president had a chance to change it. He had a chance to solve it. We would have passed the Breaux-Thomas recommendations. They wouldn't have solved it all. It's got to be much more well thought out than that. And every possible consideration has to be placed on the table. What I would do as president, I would get together the very best people in the industry. The actuaries, the accountants, the doctors, the lawyers, the experts that really understand this system, get all the facts together. And then I would lead the political types to try and come up with some solution that will help us to resolve these problems. But it's clear that we cannot continue to go with the current system, because by 2011, when all the baby boomers start coming into existence, I've got to tell you, by that time, Medicare is going to start to go bankrupt. It's gone from $3 billion in 1965 to $232 billion in 1998. It'll be $450 billion by 2008. We have to deal with it, and the next president of the United States has to have common sense, conservatism, guts to get it done, and you're looking at the guy that's worked in this area all the way through, and I'll get it done for you.
Now, Mr. Keith, let me ask you a question about what Governor Bush did down in Texas. They've got a lot of kids down there who don't get health insurance. So Democrats in the legislature said, look, there's a lot of federal money that's available. We can get it up to twice the poverty level, and we can put them under a program called CHIPS. He didn't want to go quite as far as the Democrats did in Texas, but eventually they did get the CHIPS program done. Governor wanted to have more private agencies and churches and other people fill in. Do you think that that's a wise approach, that we should have more of a combination of government and the compassion agencies, if you will, churches and philanthropic organizations?
Well, I think that the first thing we need to do is remember that the best way to regulate these matters, the best way to achieve results, is not just to concentrate on how you pay for everything, but to concentrate on how you keep the costs down. I think one of the major problems we have with this entire system, where we shifted the burden of decision-making, trying to police the relationship between price and value in the medical industry, trying to do that with bureaucracies, whether it's private bureaucracies in the insurance companies or government bureaucracies, it's not going to work. We need an approach that will put the consumer of medical services in the driver's seat, and that will not just help to pay for things. If the costs keep skyrocketing, what good is it to keep throwing money after those higher costs? We need a system that will bring those costs down. And the system that brings the cost down in every other area of our lives is a consumer police system of competition, where people have the right to make their own choices, and given that right, can then carry the dollars that they're going to use in a way that achieves the best results for them. That's what we need. And that means that wherever we're going to spend this money, we ought to voucherize it and let people make their own choices as to their medical care, so they can decide where the most effective service and the best prices are.
We need to turn to foreign policy. I'm going to let you do that in just a second, but I want to get one last question in here on domestic policy, Tom. I want to ask Senator McCain, you have said that one best way to pay for family tax relief is the cut in pork barrel spending that you've advocated. And yet, when you look at the pork list here in Iowa, you have said that there should be some $2 million cut in the fight against methamphetamines, and that is a huge priority here in Iowa. That doesn't seem like pork barrel to us.
It may not to you, but the fact is that many of these programs may have great virtue, but we'll never know because they're never placed in competition with any other program. There may be a program in Arizona that should have been considered. Instead, some powerful member of Congress or powerful special interest, thanks to huge $100,000 checks or multi-$100,000 checks, got snuck in the middle of the night in a conference without any of us knowing a program. I don't think you quite get it. The fact is, it's not the virtue of the program, it's the way that it's inserted. Every program in America should have the same right to compete with this program here in Iowa for those tax dollars, because those tax dollars come from the citizens of my state as well as Iowa. And on that subject, I'm here to tell you that I want to tell you the things that you don't want to hear as well as the things you want to hear. And one of those is ethanol. Ethanol is not worth it. It does not help the consumer. Those ethanol subsidies should be phased out, and everybody here on this stage, if it wasn't for the fact that Iowa was the first caucus state, would share my view that we don't need ethanol subsidies. It doesn't help anybody.
Not true. Senator Hatch.
Listen. Chuck Grassley came to me early I was in the Senate before he came, but he was in the Congress before I came to the Senate. He was one of the few people I went to when I ran for the Senate to see what I should do. And Chuck Grassley convinced me that here is a renewable resource that helps farmers, that literally might help us when we have another energy crisis like we did in the late 70s. I went through that. I saw it. And I can tell you it's crazy for us to not do everything we can to develop renewable resources that help farmers and that help everybody. Now, it's too expensive right now.
Mr. Bauer, very quickly.
Look, John, this is Iowa. We're leading domestic policy, and you guys haven't given us a question on probably the biggest crisis facing the state. You've touched on it with ethanol. The family farm in this state is being destroyed. It's being destroyed across the Midwest.
We will get to that.
Okay, good enough. I don't want to leave this state until we've had a chance to talk about it. Okay, there are broken hearts in this state, and we need to address that tonight.
Okay. Thank you. Tom?
Well, we shouldn't leave that now. Let's just stay with this. I mean, I want to ask Mr. Forbes, a publisher and a man who pays a lot of attention to markets and what happens. Ethanol has been around for a long time. It's primarily of interest to people in Iowa and a few other states in the Corn Belt, but primarily of interest to here. Do you think that it's had a fair test in the marketplace? And does there come a time when you say, we've invested a lot of money in that, it hasn't made it?
I think the answer is, of course, and that's why I've supported having a few years of a fair test. And in the year 2007, when this current program expires, if it can't stand on its own 2 feet, then it ought to go. In this day and age, when you think of high technology, and you can get, literally write whole worlds on grains of sand, the whole information revolution, silicon, I don't see why, with research, getting rid of the capital gains tax, so you have risk-taking, that we can't find imaginative ways to use farm products. So I think what we have here is a bankruptcy in the sense of finding new uses for agricultural products. And I think with a little investment and imagination, we will find fantastic, productive uses that will pay very rich dividends. And Gary is absolutely right in terms you mentioned markets. What is happening to farmers today in markets with their low commodity prices is not a result of just supply and demand. It's also huge mistakes from Washington, D.C. Everything from high interest rates, the same thing they did in the mid-'80s, they're doing today, depressing farm prices, to opening up foreign markets, to not hurting our existing customers through the crazy economic policies of the International Monetary Fund, which has already cost us over $30 billion of exports. It all ties together. So yes, we'll let the ethanol have its run to 2007. If it doesn't work, cut it out. But I think there are a lot of uses for agricultural products, and we should do the research to find what they are.
Governor Bush, so much of the American economy is moving to the economy of scale these days. We used to have mom-and-pop shoe stores and men's clothing stores on main streets and little drug stores. Now we've got Costco and Walmart and all the other big stores. Why should the family farm? And before anyone believes that I'm picking on them, my family grew up in that tradition. Why should the family farm be any more protected than the corner drugstore or the mom-and-pop shoe store or the little grocery store that we used to find on Main
Street?
Street?
If you ask the family farmer here in Iowa, they don't feel protected. People are hurting in this state. Family farmers all across this state are wondering, how come we don't open more markets for my corn and my hogs? And that's exactly what I'm going to do as president. I'm going to open up markets. I support ethanol, and I support ethanol strongly, John. And I support ethanol whether I was here in Iowa or not. And the reason I do...
Just a reminder to the audience, you only take away from the time that the candidates have when you do that. I know that it's so tempting.
I was just warming up.
Right.
I support ethanol because it's good for our air. It's good for the air. It's good for the quality of the air. It also reduces our dependency upon foreign oil. And if I become the president, I'm going to spend money on research and development to find additional uses for agricultural products. This is a fantastic renewable resource. It's not only here in Iowa, it's all across the Midwest, in the state of Texas. Forbes is right. Steve is right on that. We ought to spend money. We ought to spend. We ought to spend money on finding out how to on better and more uses for agricultural products. Who knows? Maybe someday we'll be driving automobiles with 100% corn product. And guess what? We can grow it right here in Iowa.
Wouldn't we have more markets for Iowa farm products if we allowed China to come into the WTO and open up 1,500,000,000 people to the Iowa grain products and hogs?
I want to address the question that you asked Governor Bush there, because I was reading the New York Times the other day where they were declaring the family farm dead, and I think it was then repeated on one of the major news shows. And folks look at the family farming system like the only thing we get from family farms is the food. It has actually been the case since the Republic was founded that the family farm from Jefferson all the way forward has been understood as one of the bedrock sources of the moral character of this nation, of the sense of the combination of individuality and commitment to community, the ability to shoulder hard work at the same time that you value the achievements of individuals in the context of their contribution to family and community. That sense of individualism that also knows how to dedicate itself to the good of others has been born and has been nurtured and has been sustained in America's family farming sector. We lose the family farm and we lose the nursery of America's moral character. We can't afford that. And I think we therefore have a stake that goes beyond money, it goes beyond food. It is vital to the future of this country. Where did we get the young men and women who were willing to sacrifice themselves in battle, rise to the extraordinary test of war every time we asked them to, have the courage that used to be supposedly restricted only to aristocrats? We found them in the fields of America, behind the plow, nurtured in the family farms of this country. We cannot let that die any more than we can let America's heart and individuality and courage die, because it's not just a question of money. It's a question of America's moral decency.
Mr. Bauer, I have to get you back to farming as well. The Freedom to Farm Act, 1996, removed restrictions on the production of major crops. And since then, we have had a huge increase in the production of those crops. We have had a plummeting of prices, and we've had a falling off of exports. Now, you have said that perhaps it should be reviewed, the Farm Act?
Yes, absolutely. Look, the politicians in Washington pulled another fast one. They came to Iowa, they went to farmers all over this great country, and they said, look, here's the deal. We're going to put you more at risk in the international marketplace. We know that's going to be tougher for you. But in exchange for that, we're going to fight to open up markets around the world. And they did not keep their end of the bargain. We let our European allies keep our beef out with this excuse about growth hormones. We let them keep Iowa corn out because of genetic engineering. All that is excuses because European governments fight to protect their farmers. We need a government in Washington that will fight to protect American farmers. I will do that as President of the United States. And by the way, Governor Bush, I will stop allowing China to play us for suckers. We've given them most favored nation status 10 years in a row. They dumped their goods here, and Iowa farmers are selling less to China now than they did 10 years ago. The time of them playing us for suckers will end in my presidency.
Governor Bush and then Senator Hatch, I need to ask you.
I'm glad you brought it up. You're not for China getting into the WTO. I don't want... Well, let me finish. I'm not asking you a question. It's kind of rhetorical here.
Okay. Oh. It's hard to tell with you sometimes, Governor.
I am. And let me tell you something. The amount of corn that'll be moved if China gets in the WTO will rise from 250,000, metric tons to 7.2 million metric tons. Opening up Chinese markets is good for Iowa farmers. Yes, sir.
Governor, here's your fallacy. You believe the Chinese government will keep their agreements. They haven't kept their agreements for 20 years.
That's why we let them in the WTO. That's part of agreement keeping. That brings China to
That just gives them another agreement to break, Governor.
No, well.
Let me take you quickly back to the Freedom to Farm Act.
You want to isolate the farmer.
I don't want to drop that yet because Senator Hatch, you voted for the Freedom to Farm Act.
Right. And it was the right thing to do. If farmers want to make better profits off of their farm commodities, the only way to get there is to get into the free market. But having said that, we have not done a good job in helping them in the transition. This has been a tough time for farmers. In this country, we only spend 9% for food in this country, the lowest in the world. And farmers are on the bottom of the totem pole as far as getting recompense for their work. We had 22 million family farms in 1990. Today we have 5 million. Some of that happens because of death taxes. The family farm has to be sold to pay the 55% death tax. That's ridiculous. I think everybody up here is against that, and I'll lead the fight to get rid of it, and in doing so, along with Chuck Grassley on the Finance Committee. With regard to WTO, I was in China in the late 70s, the early 80s, the late 80s, the early 90s, and the late 90s. The difference between the late 70s and the late 90s, because of market and economics and Hong Kong, is so stark
The best way to undermine that police state is to not isolate China and have them withdraw, but bring them into the WTO where they've got to live up to norms of conduct like the rest of the world. And that will help Iowa farmers. And it'll help farmers all over this land. One other thing. It's pathetic in this country. Well, I'll finish with this. It's pathetic in this country that state-inspected meat cannot be sold outside of the state, while we take foreign meat in here and sell it all over the country. We're going to change that, and I'm in the process of doing that now.
I've been reading the Iowa Republican Party platform. We're here in the state of Iowa, and I have for each of you some questions that arise out of the very graphic language in that platform. If I could begin with you, Mr. Forbes. It calls for the elimination of the minimum wage, the Iowa Republican Party platform. Do you think that's a good idea?
On a national level, on a state level, if they have a state minimum wage, and I don't know if they do, if they want to get rid of it, fine. But they are under federal law. We have a minimum wage, and there's no way they can opt out of that. But in terms of minimum wage, Tom, I think the best way to raise wages in this country is not through government decree. The Europeans have tried that, and the result is massive unemployment among young people. The way to do it is remove barriers to people getting ahead, have investment incentives, get more growth than we have today, which we're capable of doing in productivity. In my part of the world, Tom, you can't hire people for less than $6 or $6.50. That's the way to bring it up, not through fiat. The Europeans tried it, doesn't work.
Senator McCain, in the Iowa Republican Party platform, they call for the prohibition of women in any combat role. No one on this stage or almost in America has more combat experience than you do. Do you think that's a good idea? Prohibit women from combat?
No, I don't. And it's already been proven in the Persian Gulf War that women performed extraordinarily with heroism and skill and courage, including in a POW experience. I want to go back to ethanol. It was a program. It was a program at the height of the energy crisis that was brought in, was supposed to be phased out, and obviously 2007 is quite a while, 35 years. But the fact is, we know why farmers have been hurting so much. It's because the Asian markets went down, and they were unable to export. And the fact is, now we will be able to export. I agree with George Bush that China will absorb these exports. Every nation in the world should be open to our best products. The best and most productive farmer in the world is the farmer of Iowa, and the people in Beijing and Bangkok and Paris will be eating Iowa pork, and they'll love every minute of it when I'm President of the United States.
If I can get back to the Iowa Party platform, Mr. Bauer, it says that creationism is a science and evolution is a theory, and they ought to be taught equitably in the schools. Do you agree with the entire premise of that statement in the Iowa Republican Party platform?
Well, here's what I agree with, Tom, that the majority of the American people believe that God had a hand in the creation of life on Earth.
You think one's a science and one's a theory, though?
I think that certainly evolution is a theory, and yet it's taught in our schools as if it cannot be questioned. If you ask the American people what they want about this, they want their children exposed to both of those ideas. That's what an education ought to be about, presenting to young people a variety of choices and let them make the decision. And by the way, I sense a follow-up. Let me just say, if you want to read a wacko platform, you ought to try reading the Iowa Democratic Party platform.
I get the impression we have some Iowa Republicans in the hall here. Senator Hatch, continuing with the Iowa GOP platform, they call for the elimination of the Environmental Protection Agency. Do you think that's a good idea?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't agree with environmental extremism that would make us uncompetitive with the rest of the world. One of the first things I said I would do, I listed yesterday for everybody 7 things I'd do the first day I was in office. And one of them is I would revoke the Kyoto Accords. The Kyoto Accords place environmental extreme requirements on the United States, but nobody else. And in the final analysis, there's no real reason, scientific or otherwise, why that should occur. It would cost the average family $30,000 more. It would cost our senior citizens, Iowa senior citizens, and you have a lot of senior citizens in this state, it would cost them $1,500 to $3,000 more for fuel costs alone every year. Can you imagine? And that's why we would revoke that, because it's environmental extremism at its worst. And I think, but having said that, all of us believe in clean air, clean water, in a better quality of life. And the Environmental Protection Agency, properly run by a Hatch administration, would do a job like's never been done before, and I think everybody in Iowa would be darn glad about it.
Governor Bush, I have a kind of a two-part question. I just want to clarify one thing. The platform also calls for the elimination and the phasing out of Medicare and Medicaid and privatize those programs entirely.
No.
Bad idea?
I think it is. I think Medicare is the responsibility of the federal government. It's a commitment we've got to keep. The problem with Medicare is it's run by a 135,000 more or less page document where the government decides everything. They decide how the patient chooses things and how the doctors perform. I think we need to give patients more choice and doctors more flexibility. And so I think it's a bad idea.
You told my colleague and friend Tim Russert on Meet the Press that you think that patients should have the right to sue their HMO.
I do.
And then I looked at your website, and it has a caveat, federally approved HMOs. Did you mean for it to have that caveat? Does everyone who belongs to an HMO have the right to sue?
Let me tell you what I told Mr. Russert. I talked about a piece of law that we enacted in Texas. And here's the law. It says if you got a complaint with your HMO, you the patient, you can take your complaint to what's called an independent review organization, an IRO. It's a group of objective-minded people that hear your claim, that hear your cause. If they decide, if the objective folks decide that the HMO is wrong, and the HMO ignores the finding, that then becomes a cause of action. And I'm not exactly sure the wording on the website, but I am sure it's talking about making sure federal law does not preempt the good piece of legislation we have in the state of Texas. You see, I believe states should run most of their business. I believe strongly that the government closest to the people is that which governs best.
Well, as I read the website, and as others have read it, it said federally approved HMOs.
That's because we covered non-federally approved HMOs in my state of Texas.
But you would make this the national standard. You would have a national review board and make that possible for everyone.
Yes, I would.
Alan Keyes.
If I could quickly, a related question on Medicare that a lot of our viewers asked about, and we want to try to get one of those questions in. We'll ask Mr. Keyes. Medicare payments to hospitals and insurers and doctors are so inequitable when you look at various states. That's what we received in many mails to us. Because here in Iowa, the payment per enrollee is under $3,500, and the national average is above $5,000. And this strains hospitals. Some hospitals are closing. Can it be made more equitable?
I think one of the problems you're faced with there is that you're making determinations in bureaucracies that ought, in fact, to be made in the marketplace. Costs are different in different parts of the country. They would be reflected in the marketplace if people have the opportunity to make the choices I think that they ought to have the opportunity to make, rather than having those limits imposed upon them by bureaucratic determination and fiat. There are differences. You can't cite a national average and then say we should have uniform payments everywhere. It would make no sense. But at the same time, bureaucracies may not come up with the best answer. I want to try one thing, though, because I have to draw a contrast here on the trade issue between myself and I guess everybody else who's sitting up here. Because they're busy arguing about whether China should be in the World Trade Organization or out of the World Trade Organization. And I look at an organization that is unrepresentative, elected by no one, where dictators and tyrants have the same right to send representatives to make substantive decisions that the representatives of this free people have, making decisions that will affect our jobs and our livelihood in a fashion totally contrary to our Constitution. I don't think the question is whether China should belong to the World Trade Organization. I think the question is whether the United States should belong to an organization that violates every constitutional principle.
Mr. Ford, very briefly, you believe that we should be a part of the WTO.
The what?
The WTO.
I believe we should, but I have no illusions about it. I've compared the WTO, John, to a woolly mammoth without the charm. It is so big that this next round of negotiations that they wanted to kick off in Seattle, the last one, the Uruguay round, took 13 years. This one's going to take probably 25 or 30 years. I think we should take action on our own. And that's why I proposed, for example, doing a North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement with Ireland and Britain, bring in on the Pacific side Australia, New Zealand, and other nations. Do it ourselves. We can't wait for the WTO. It's useless.
Mr. Ford, thank you very much. Now we come to that portion of the program tonight in which, by drawing, the candidates get to ask each other questions. And for the second time tonight, Gary Bauer gets to begin by asking Governor Bush a question.
Yes. It's becoming a habit.
Yes, it is. Governor Bush, I believe strongly that the big civil rights challenge going into the next century will be whether or not we can set another place at the table for America's unborn children. America's always been about welcoming other people to the table. You've said you don't want to leave one child behind, but 1.5 million children a year are being left behind. My judges will be pro-life. I want Roe versus Wade to be overturned. I want to ask you a simple yes or no question. Will you commit tonight to having a pro-life running mate? I'm willing to say that Governor Christie Todd Whitman of New Jersey, the pro-abortion Republican governor, doesn't need to stick close to her phone. I won't be calling her to be my running mate. Are you willing to make a similar commitment for a pro-life running mate?
I think it's incredibly presumptive for someone who's yet to earn his party's nomination to be picking vice presidents. I'll tell you what I will do. I'll name somebody who can be the president. That ought to be the main criterion for any one of us who has the opportunity to pick a vice president, Gary. It's going to be, can that person serve as president of the United States? I'm also going to ask the question, will the person be loyal? There's nothing to be worse than to have a vice president be disloyal to the president. And of course, I would expect that person to share my conservative views.
Governor, we get a follow-up, as I understand. Governor,
You do?
Well, that was my understanding.
No.
We don't?
No, you do. But you can if you want.
Well, he wants me to give a follow-up.
No, in fact, Mr. Forbes, you now ask a question of Mr. Bauer, so you will receive.
Okay. Absolutely.
Well, Gary,
yes, Steve.
One of the great destructive forces in the world today, I think, is the International Monetary Fund and the disastrous prescriptions they give to the countries, raising taxes, devaluing their money, wreaking havoc. Their prescriptions, along with our Treasury Department, have cost farmers $30 billion in agricultural exports. They brought about a huge disaster in Mexico. Would you agree with me that the International Monetary Fund should go to the political equivalent of Jurassic Park, and we have true free enterprise, free market economic prescriptions for these countries instead of this unnecessary austerity and devastation?
Steve, I think there's a whole group of these international organizations like the WTO that Alan referred to, the International Monetary Fund, a lot of the things, quite frankly, that the United Nations has been engaged in. I think we need to review all of those things. We're sacrificing too much of America's sovereignty. We're being plagued by suckers, by international bureaucrats, and the good taxpayers of this state are having their hard-earned money to not only subsidize the politicians in Washington, D.C., but a lot of bureaucrats in these international organizations that they can't touch through the election process. So, yes, I would review it, and I would reform it or get rid of it.
I hope we make a pledge to get rid of it, because I think it's beyond repair.
Now, that was
and the farmers would agree.
No provisions, as I remember, for a colloquy, but we like to have it. Alan Keyes, you get to ask the next question, and as you know, you get to ask the next question of Senator Hatch.
Senator Hatch, I heard with some curiosity, I think at the last debate, that you were defending the decision of the judge in the Microsoft case, and I have to confess that decision worries me. Because I think it's a little bit of a departure to start defining the ownership of a product that has been produced by one's own ingenuity as a monopoly. Of course you have a monopoly on products that you make yourself. And it has always been understood that part of making a profit is to take advantage of that monopoly to get the best deal you can when you bring that target product to the marketplace. Aren't we just punishing Microsoft because, in fact, it is a successful product which the government now wants to step in and take over in the most socialist fashion imaginable?
Well, not according to one of the best federal judges in the country, who wrote an exhaustive opinion showing how Microsoft is not just a monopoly, but Microsoft has been using its monopoly power to stifle innovation and creativity and opportunity for others. At least this is what this judge seems to be finding. And I have to say that we had literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people complaining to me as chairman of the Judiciary Committee to look into this, because they felt that they were being snuffed out of business by Microsoft. One in particular testified that Microsoft put a bug in their operating platform that
that he had to be on in order to be successful. And he happens to be the most successful business in the streaming industry to begin with. The fact of the matter is they put a bug in it so his program would be incompatible. That was testimony before our committee. That's the type of stuff that this judge is finding. You can be a monopoly, and you can fight as hard as you can to increase your monopoly power, but you don't have a right to tramp on the little guy. You don't have a right to use your monopoly power, owning the underlying operating platform, to insist that all the OEMs, the original equipment operators, manufacturers, have to take only your program to the exclusion of everybody else, which is also one of the allegations. No, to be honest with you, that's why the antitrust laws are in existence.
Governor Bush, you're directing a question to Senator McCain.
I do. You've been talking a lot about pork in Washington. I appreciate that. Here's my view. If you want to get rid of pork in Washington, stop feeding the hog. That's why I have proposed a $450 billion plus tax cut plan, which you called excessive. One of the features in my plan, John, says to the single mom with 2 children making $40,000 a year, you get a 53% tax cut. For single moms with children who make less than $40,000 a year, get bigger tax cuts. My question to you is, in reviewing of your plan, that single mom with children, 2 children making $40,000, gets no tax cut, and I'm wondering why.
Well, I think it's something that's worthy of consideration, but I also believe that if you raise the 15% tax bracket to singles or couples who make $70,000 a year, that would go a long way in that direction. It's funny you mention about pork, because really what the American people need is their money back. And they're not going to get it back until we get it out of the hands of the special interests. These huge 6- and 7-figure donations, the $100,000 checks, the $200,000 checks, that have basically taken the government away from the people and put it into the hands of the special interests. And it's made all these young people so cynical and even alienated. I'll tell you what, in all due respect to my friends here, you and I can stop that tonight. Because we can commit, as nominees of the party, that we will have nothing to do with soft money, with these huge $100,000 checks. We can stop it now. We commit to that, and we can get the special interest money out of American politics. We can give the government back to the people. I hope you'll make that commitment right here tonight in Iowa.
And I'll be glad to talk about it.
You want to talk about it any more right now, or you want to wait and talk about it? We're doing all right. We got time, Governor.
I'd love to talk about it. Here's my worry with your plan. It's going to hurt the Republican Party, John, and I'm worried for this reason. And let me finish. Let me
Ronald Reagan get elected in 1980? There's no such thing as soft money.
May I finish? The Democrat Party is really the Democrat Party and the labor unions in America. And my worry is that you do nothing about what's called paycheck protection. We do nothing about saying to the labor union, you can't take a laboring man's money and spend it the way you see fit. There's a lot of laboring people who are Republicans and conservatives. And yet, under the vision you've got, or I guess you got, or people in Washington have, it's okay that they just take their money and spend it the way they want to spend it. I don't think it's fair. And I think that's unilateral disarmament. I agree with you, we ought not to have corporate soft money and labor soft money. But there better be paycheck protection. Otherwise, our Republican Party and our conservative values don't have a shot.
I don't know how. I still don't know how we won in 1980 in the Senate and the presidency of the United States.
May I futilely try to get control here for just a moment? We're going to get to you. You get a question coming up in a few moments. Then you can promise, Alan, you get a chance to
One brief remark, though, because if we're going to have a colloquy, we ought to have all options on the table. These folks actually deal with irrelevant things. The government does not have the right to restrict our freedom of association, which should include the right to associate our money with the causes we believe in. And I think that this whole idea, the whole idea that everybody here subscribes to, that they should be regulating contributions, it's very simple. No dollar vote without a ballot vote, and publicity for all contributions. We don't need the rest of it. We can regulate the system through our ballot if we have the freedom to do what we should as individual voters with our money.
Senator Hatch, as I was saying, I'm in total control here, as you can tell. And it's your question now to Mr. Forbes.
Well, I'm going to colloquize for a minute first. John seems to think that every problem in America is going to be solved by the McCain-Feingold bill, an unconstitutional bill that basically penalizes Republicans. Have any of you ever wondered why all the Democrats support it and hardly any Republicans in the Congress? Just think about it. Now, let me ask Steve a question, and I'm going to give you home run ball, Steve. Look,
that usually means hold your wallet.
Steve, I couldn't even lift your wallet, is all I can say. I'm running a Skinny Cat campaign, wearinghats.com. Go there and help me out.
Senator, with the flat tax, you'll have a better wallet, and with my Social Security reform, you'll have a secure retirement and not have that pension system of the United States Senate which rips off the taxpayers.
Well, Steve, and with my experience of 23 years, I'm the one that can get it through, and I'll do it as president. Let me tell you. Well, now, let me ask you a question.
I'll be relying on you when I'm in the White House to get these things through.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
You know, we're talking about a lack of values in this country. We all know it's there. We know our kids don't have the right examples. We know that there are a lot of things that are denigrating to our children and our people in Iowa and throughout the country. My only brother was killed in the Second World War. The most valuable thing I own is the flag that draped his coffin when they brought him back. I'm the author of the Anti-Flag Desecration Constitutional Amendment. And what I want to do is get 2/3 of the Congress to pass that amendment and then go out through those 50 states and create a debate on values like we've never had before. Will you join me?
Senator, absolutely. I support the constitutional amendment concerning the desecration of the flag. And I think that's...
Thanks. I knew you would.
That's why, too, I vigorously support now, not 3 years from now, not as a gift from the federal government, but right now, giving parents choice on choosing the schools they think best, so we can get morals and values back in the schools through the parents and not have to rely on top-down bureaucracies. But then there's also, you talk about values. In my home state of New Jersey, there's a proposal to read the Declaration of Independence, those opening sentences that we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know, there's controversy about that because it mentions the word creator, and our own governor, Christy Whitman, says she may not like it because it takes too much time out of the day.
That's
and
pathetic.
she's about to endorse Governor Bush. I think we need to get back to basics. But you bring, Senator, you bring up something very valid. When people can question the constitutionality of reading the Declaration of Independence in our schools, I have the kids read it each day, you know there's something fundamentally wrong. And that's why I think you sense in America the beginnings of a spiritual and moral renewal.
I told you to be a softball, Steve. I told you to be a softball. But
Senator McCain, the final candidate question to Ambassador Keyes.
Alan, there's a terrible thing going on in the world right now, and it's genocide, and it's creating hundreds of thousands of refugees. It's destabilizing the region. And a tragic commentary on our time is that because it's not in our living rooms on television, a lot of people are not aware of it. I'm speaking, obviously, of Chechnya. The Russians have threatened mass bombings, have already carried out artillery attacks. It's destabilizing to the region. We know that the oil and gas reserves that are in the region are important to the future of our energy supply. We know that the Russian military is asserting itself in a way that they have not since the end of the breakup of the Soviet Union. And there's a lot of other implications associated with what's going on in Chechnya now. It offends our Judeo-Christian values and principles. It also can, over time, offend our national interests. Mr. Yeltsin the other day mentioned something about we forget that Russia has nuclear weapons. No, we don't forget that. But let's address this issue. Let's get the attention of the American people on this issue. The President of the United States is neglecting it,
And I want to know what your prescription is as to what you as President of the United States would do.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you started off with that description, I thought, sure, you were going to ask me about Sudan. And of course, the reason I mentioned that is not, no, I'm not going the obvious place. I'm not going to point out that we have allowed the carnage in Sudan to take place, totally oblivious to a death toll that now rises over 2 million, regularly hundreds of thousands every year. I am not going to suggest that we take no interest in that because the people who are dying are black. That would, in fact, probably not be true. I will suggest, however, that I find it very strange, and you were one of those folks out there shilling for this Kosovo business. I think it rather undercut the position of NATO and the Europeans, who are now on their high horse because the Soviets are threatening to bomb civilians. We forget that several months ago we were in that same position, and the attacks that were taking place in Kosovo were not attacks on American soil, were not attacks on American targets by terrorists who are terrorizing our population. In fact, we had intervened in an internal conflict in another country. So I think we better be careful. If we had been careful then, we'd have more moral authority now. I do, because I oppose that surrender of our moral position, have the moral authority to say what I'm about to say. And that is that I think that even though the Russians right now are dealing with a problem technically internal to their country, I don't believe we should be committing aggression in order to deal with it, but I do believe we should govern our own behavior. And that means we shouldn't be contributing our money and support to the perpetuation of that kind of carnage. We can't have business as usual, not with the Russians and not with the Chinese when they are doing things that deeply offend the conscience and values of our people. I don't believe in taking over other people's countries, but I do believe in governing the trade relations and money and participation of this country in international affairs in a way that accords with our values and conscience, the things for which our men and women have sacrificed their lives over the decades. And I think we ought to do so now sternly and clearly in a way that the Clinton administration doesn't have the prudence or the courage to do.
Thank you, Mr. Keith. That's the appropriate transition to talk some about foreign policy. Governor Bush, you have said that you supported the idea of rejecting the Test Ban Treaty and you want to build a missile defense system. If you were the president, if you were President Jiang Zemin in China or if you were President Boris Yeltsin in Russia, wouldn't you be saying to your military personnel and to your scientists, they want to start it up again, we've got to do everything that we can to go on a hair trigger, and we've got to expand our own nuclear arsenal?
No, they'd be hearing a different message. They'd be hearing a message that the United States is a peaceful nation, that we intend to keep the peace. But we're not going to sit by and allow rogue nations to hold any of our friends hostage, that we're not going to allow for accidental launches, and we've got the technology necessary to keep the peace. Mr. Yeltsin will hear from President Bush that I intend to give you a chance to join us in the development of theater-based and national anti-ballistic missile systems, but after a short period of time, if you choose not to, we'll withdraw from the treaty. Because we're a peaceful nation. But we're not going to miss an opportunity, Tom, if I'm the president, to say to our friends and allies, we're going to provide a shield so you won't be blackmailed. We're going to say to our friends, the Israelis, we'll provide you a shield to work with you so you won't become blackmailed by Iranians or Iraqis. No, our country must not retreat. We must not worry about what the Russians and Chinese think. What we need to do is lead the world to peace, and that's exactly the kind of president I intend to be.
Would you give that shield? Would you give that shield to Taiwan, Senator McCain, and would you say to the Russians simultaneously, let's jump to START 3 and get it down to 1,000 nuclear warheads at the same time?
Well,
operate on several fronts?
Yes, several questions. No, I would not go to SALT 3 because that would be dismantling one leg of the triad, and I'm not prepared to do that yet, to START 3. I would not give the Taiwanese ballistic missile defense system. I would develop myself, have it seaborne, and I would move it into the area, if necessary, in international waters. I would achieve the same goal, but I would also help the Taiwanese acquire weapon systems if necessary. They are a democratic, free government. The One China policy is based on the fundamental principle of peaceful reunification of China. It will be China that violates the One China policy if they commit aggression. And the fact is
that these are not the bloody butchers of Beijing as candidate Clinton described them in 1992, and they are not our strategic partners as he described them in 1998 when he put his arm around the Chinese leadership. They are ruthless people hell-bent on hanging on to power. They look over their shoulder at the collapse of the Soviet Union and the loss of power of the leadership there. But we can convince them that it is in their interest to enter the world as a superpower, which they will, in a peaceful, contributory fashion. And I would go back to our old alliances, the strategic partner of which is the Japanese. And this part of the world is very, very critical, not only to our global economy, but to the farmers right here in Iowa as a major place where they can export their products.
President Lee of Taiwan says that it's pernicious fiction, his phrase, to think that the Chinese have any claim on Taiwan, that they will only negotiate as a sovereign state. Does that mean that we just eliminate the idea of one China?
Well, that was unfortunate language, but let me just say, am I on?
You're on.
Okay. Let me just say this, that I was one of the authors of the Taiwan Relations Act, which means that we're going to give Taiwan support because as a free country, we don't want them walked all over. But I also met with Jiang Zemin, President Jiang Zemin, 2 years ago in Shanghai. A half-hour courtesy call turned into an hour-and-a-half call because I said I was one of the authors of the Taiwan Relations Act, and isn't it wonderful what has resulted from that? And he went, oh. And I said, and you could see he was very upset, and I said, well, just think about it. Before that act, you didn't have an intercourse with Taiwan, you didn't have exchange students, you didn't have business going back and forth, you weren't even in the game to get Hong Kong. He leaned back in his chair and went, oh. And then all of a sudden, that half-hour conversation turned into an hour-and-a-half conversation. The American ambassador said, I've never seen anything like it. But let me tell you, we owe an obligation to Taiwan. We have it in writing. It's in a formal act. And I've got to tell you, when we make an obligation and a commitment, we ought to keep it. And I'm for keeping those obligations. And I think China, we can, through good diplomacy and toughness, we can get China to back off on those type of activities.
Mr. Bauer, can I move you to the Middle East? Would you...
I'd rather not do China, but let me just say one quick thing. I'm glad to hear Senator Hatch say what he just said, but I have to say, in all due respect to my colleagues, that I'm hearing a naivete up here about the leaders in Beijing that is breathtaking. Does anybody in this arena think that if today in China, thousands of Chinese citizens gathered for the basic human rights that we take for granted, the right to vote for another political party other than the communists, the right to have a child without government permission, that anything different would happen today than happened 10 years ago when Chinese students waved copies, as Steve mentioned a little earlier, of the Declaration of Independence in the face of the People's Liberation Army. Gentlemen, we cannot trade ourselves out of this challenge. That nation intends to replace the United States in the Pacific as the leading world power. And to deal with it, we're going to have to do more than trade. We're going to have a Reagan-esque foreign policy that's willing to speak the truth to evil. That's what will make the people of China a free people and worthy to be trade partners.
Tom, I will pick up on your Mideast question.
What all of this underscores is we don't have a foreign policy today. What we have is appeasement and confusion. And with China, we need to let the Chinese know what the rules of engagement are. So if they want a prosperous relationship, they want to evolve towards democracy like Taiwan did, we'll deal with them. But we have to make it clear to them, among other things, we will not let them push us out of Asia. We will not let them take over Taiwan. And also, we have to make very clear that we will criticize them each step of the way for their human rights abuses in every international forum possible. And in terms of trade, it has to be two ways. They have to reduce barriers, and they have to keep agreements, which they haven't done in the past. If you lay down firm rules, I think you can have a relationship. But if you go on drifting what we have done now, it's going to lead to disaster in the future.
Mr. Forbes, you criticized the Clinton administration's foreign policy, and yet tonight the prospects for peace in the Mideast are looking much brighter. Talks have resumed now this week between Israel and Syria, talks resuming between Israel and Yasser Arafat. In the past, you've been very critical, saying that this administration has dictated peace terms to Israel, has supported a Palestinian state. What, isn't this working?
Well,
The real answer to that, John, is if they get an agreement that stands the test of time. And one of the dangers that Israel faces today is with a president who wants to leave a legacy and is going to push Israel to make concessions they shouldn't make. For example, you can't live with a neighbor who is preaching hatred against you. You look at the Palestinian textbooks today. They're full of vitriol about Jews, the protocols of Zion, stuff that we saw in Nazi Germany in the 30s. And that's what's in the schools today. That blood libel Mrs. Arafat did about the Israelis causing cancer in water. That is common stuff there. So you cannot have peace preaching that kind of hatred. It's got to be both ways. The Israelis are willing to make an agreement, but Arafat is not willing to make the fundamental shift that's going to make a lasting peace possible. And as president, I'm not going to twist Israeli arms to get a false peace.
Mr. Bauer, you have spoken of the State Department's neutrality in the Middle East conflict. Pick it up.
Well, look, we need an American desk at the State Department. You know, we've got bureaucrats there who are worried about every other country in the world except our vital interests. And our vital interests in the Middle East are served by a safe and democratic Israel. They have been our most reliable ally in the region. They're surrounded by hostile territory. And it is the height of arrogance for State Department bureaucrats and the current administration to be pressuring that country to give up more land for peace and security. We wouldn't allow somebody to pressure us under similar circumstances.
You don't think the prospects tonight are good, though, with the resumption of talks?
Look, the thing that will preserve Israel is a strong military and a reliable ally in the United States. If their enemies ever think that our commitment to them is wavering, Israel will be in the deepest trouble it's been in its existence. We are friends, we are allies, they have stood with us, and as president, I will be sure that we stand with them.
I have a question for John McCain, John Bachman. Something is in the news. You've said that Elian Gonzalez, the young Cuban boy, ought not to be sent back to Havana. Everybody on this panel believes in the primary place of family, and yet, based on what I'm reading, you're saying the state knows better than his own father and his own grandparents in this case.
No, I'm not, Tom. I'm saying that his mother knows better. His mother gave up her life in an attempt to give her son the freedom and democracy which this country is blessed with and which he never could have had if he'd remained in Cuba. That's what's left out of this equation.
Do you leave his father out of this altogether? This is the blood father of this son. He has no claim.
Like practically everyone here, I'd be glad if his father came to the United States or a neutral country and then declared his allegiance. By the way, I have never seen a spontaneous demonstration in any communist country. Could I return one moment to the Middle East? I would like to give the Clinton administration credit. I'd like to give President Carter credit. I'd like to give a lot of people credit who worked for a long time on peace in the Middle East. And I think it's important, and we're on the threshold. There's a number of factors, but a major factor was the end of the Cold War, which Ronald Reagan won, which no longer allowed for this divisions along Cold War lines where these Middle East countries were client states. Finally, Mr. Assad is growing old. He wants his son to take over, not his brother. But there's a fundamental principle that we have to reach here, and that is free and democratically elected countries in the Middle East besides Israel if you want a lasting peace.
I'm surprised that we've gotten to this point in the debate and we haven't talked at all about Social Security or some of the tax cuts. You said as a front runner you do have an obligation not to just throw numbers around. You talked about a $483 billion tax cut, about an enormous amount of money for military readiness and for increasing pay in the military. The Congressional Budget Office says that just is not going to add up downstream. 5 years out, you're going to eat up all the surpluses just with your tax cut. Are you willing to say tonight that if it gets to that point, you don't want to be in the position that your father was, where he had to raise taxes when he promised he wouldn't?
It's not going to get to that point. We took a very conservative approach. We took all the Social Security money and left it for one thing, Social Security. We took the budget additions that I think are important, particularly strengthening the military, and put that in the budget. And we had $100 billion left over. Had $100 billion unspent money. It's important to cut the taxes, Tom, otherwise government's going to spend it. And it's important to cut the taxes to keep the economy growing. And when we cut the taxes, it's important to remember there's a lot of folks who are struggling on what I call the outskirts of poverty. I mentioned it to John in the question that the single mom with kids, which, by the way, in my judgment, is the toughest job in America. It's important for the Republicans to hear their call, too. It's important that when we make the tax code fair, we hear people at the bottom of the economic ladder as well as the top. And so my plan says if you're a mom making $22,000 a year and you head to the middle class, we're going to tear down the toll booth so you can get to the middle class. Now, this is a responsible plan. The only way to get rid of the so-called surpluses in the short term is to put Al Gore or Bill Bradley as President of the United States, and they'll spend it all.
John Bachman, you have a question from the good folks of Iowa.
Well, I do. We have tried to take viewers' questions tonight and point them in the direction of some of these issues we've been talking about, but I'd like to run the table quickly with one individual question. What political philosopher or thinker, Mr. Forbes, do you most identify with and why? Which gives the remaining 5 time to think. I'm sorry.
Well, I won't say I'm reading a book by a philosopher, and I'm not reading a book on Dean Acheson. But seriously, the philosopher that I think has had the most impact or profound impact on this country is John Locke. Even though there are some flaws, I think he set the stage for what became a revolution. And then, after that, Thomas Jefferson, with what he wrote in the Declaration of Independence. James, okay, you got Locke, and then Jefferson is B.
Thank you. Mr. Keith.
Well, I think overall the most influential thinker, and there are many in my mind, but particularly on the issues we face as Americans right now, would be the founders of this country, who not only had interesting thoughts, they actually translated them capably into functioning instruments of government that have preserved our liberty now for over 200 years. And I think we ought to get back to their thinking and not fiddle with this income tax system, but return to the original Constitution they gave us. Abolish the income tax, fund the federal government with tariffs, duties, and excise taxes so the people of this country get back control of every dollar that they earn instead of having to depend on nice politicians like Mr. Bush or bad politicians like Bill Clinton to decide how much of their own money they should keep.
At least he called me nice.
Governor Bush, a philosopher thinker, and why?
Christ, because he changed my heart.
I think that the viewer would like to know more on how he's changed your heart.
Well, if they don't know, it's going to be hard to explain. When you turn your heart and your life over to Christ, when you accept Christ as a Savior, it changes your heart, it changes your life. And that's what happened to me.
Senator Hatch.
I agree with that, but I think that goes without saying. No question in my mind. But I'll tell you, there are two that I really believe have had a profound, lasting imprint on America, among many. And of course, Abraham Lincoln's one of them, who fought for equality and freedom for everybody. And the other one was Ronald Reagan, who ignored the State Department knocking out the evil empire in every speech until he got a speech where it was knocked out, it got back and forth, and he said it anyway. And it was one of the most profound statements, philosophically, that was said in our generation. And those two people really have made a difference in all of our lives. But I bear witness to Christ, too. I really know him to be the Savior of the world. And that means more to me than almost anything else I know.
Senator McCain?
Obviously, all of our founding fathers, probably the most remarkable group of men ever assembled in history in Philadelphia. But my modern-day role model and hero is Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was larger than life. Theodore Roosevelt believed in reform. He took the politics of America out of the hands of the robber barons and gave it back to the people. He put the United States of America on the world stage in the international arena, which made way for our ever-expanding role in the world. He established our national park system. He was an activist, he was a reformer, and he was a man of great vision. He was larger than life, and he was a truly wonderful father and family man as well, who happened, by the way, to lose a son in World War I.
But Theodore Roosevelt, I think, is a modern-day role model for me and many other people who hold dear conservative principles and yet believe there's a role for government in our society.
And finally, Mr. Bauer.
I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Christ, with those words, taught all of us about our obligations to each other, to the unborn child, to those living in poverty, the need for us to be together regardless of the color of our skin. There is no figure in human history who through his life, his death, and his resurrection has changed the world for millions, billions, countless of people. If America is in trouble in the next century, it will be because we forgot what he taught us.
Tom?
Tell me, we have time for what? One more question, one more answer? One more question? Governor Bush, Bill Buckley, no bleeding heart liberal, commenting on the law and order attitude of all of you, says that in 47 states, possession of marijuana is illegal. If you believe in the aggressive pursuit of people for violating the gun laws, why not have the aggressive pursuit of violation of marijuana laws? Do you think that we ought to be far more aggressive in the state of Texas and across this country in pursuing those people who possess marijuana?
I think we ought to be far more aggressive at interdicting drugs before they come in our country, and I think we need to be very aggressive at saying to children, drugs will ruin your life. If you abuse drugs, it's going to ruin your life. If you abuse alcohol, it's going to ruin your life. Baby boomer generation needs to hear the call of responsibility. And part of that is to say to our kids, don't be using drugs. Don't be using drugs. Mr. Buckley actually believes we ought to, I think he believes we ought to legalize marijuana. I don't. I think that'd be a big mistake.
I don't think that he says legalization of it. I think what he does say is not put everyone in jail who is merely possessing.
Well, we don't do that in the state of Texas. We put the dealers and the big users in jail. You know, we give people second chances. We say to people, you've made a mistake. The judges in our state have got a lot of discretion, and that's the way it should be. But the universal message from our society has got to be to our kids, don't be using drugs. Drugs will ruin your life.
Governor Bush, thank you very much. We're going to begin now the final round of the closing statements. My, how time flies when you're having fun. We begin with you, Mr. Forbes.
Well, thank all of you very much here at WHO. This is where Ronald Reagan got his start decades ago in his career. Tonight, and with these other forums, you're beginning to get an opportunity to find out what each of us believes, what we think America's opportunities are, and what the problems are. I'm an independent outsider. I believe in the conservative philosophy that comes from the Declaration of Independence, and I have deep convictions about what can be done to realize America's full potential going into this new century and this new millennium. And I believe that means putting power back in the hands of the people and not going along with politics as usual. Politics as usual says we have to keep the current tax code. I think the American people should say it's realistic to get rid of it and allow you to keep far, far more of what you earn with something that is simple, honest, and fair. I believe a new birth of freedom means that you should be able to choose your own schools for your own children, that you should be able to choose your own doctors and not have to go through HMOs and other bureaucracies. It all ties together, but I need your support, I need your vote. Thank you very much.
Please hold your applause so we can get the final statements in. The closing statement now from Mr. Bauer.
Thank you very much. The Republican Party was born in an argument about whether black men and women, slaves, were citizens to be protected under the law. It is a proud history of our party, the party of Abraham Lincoln and of Ronald Reagan. We are facing an issue today that is comparable, and that is whether our unborn children, rich or poor, black or white, deserve a place at the table, whether they're part of the American family. For 25 years, I've worked on this issue. I've raised money for crisis pregnancy centers while my friend Steve Forbes was raising money for Christy Todd Whitman. This issue is important. We can't play any more games about it. I will not leave any child behind. My running mate, Governor Bush, will be pro-life. I'm sorry you were not willing to make that commitment. My judges will be pro-life. And I want to make the most important promise I can make to you about my presidency. In my presidency, abortion on demand will end. I will not sacrifice one American child for political gain. You can count on it.
Senator Hatch.
I'm a person of very deep conviction. And my 23 years in the Congress of the United States and the Senate proves that. As I've gone around Iowa, I found a great deal of similarity and companionship in Iowa values compared to our Utah values. We're very much alike. I've got to tell you, I wasn't born in wealth. We lost our home right after I was born. As a matter of fact, I raised chickens as a young man, sold eggs door to door. When I went to college, I worked as a janitor. When Ted Kennedy found that out, he said, "Orrin, you should have stuck with it." I learned a trade. I learned a skilled trade and worked for 10 years in construction with my bare hands, and I was a darn good worker, the best. And I want you to know that I've approached government that way as well. I've been married to the same woman for 43 years. We have 6 children, 19 grandchildren. I'm concerned about them and you, and I'll do my best if I'm elected president.
Governor Bush.
I want to thank my friends here in Iowa. I'm honored to have your support. I appreciate all the work you're doing on my behalf. I come to your state not from Washington, but from outside, a state called Texas. I've got a record, not of rhetoric, but a record of results. In my state, I led our state to the 2 biggest tax cuts in the state's history. Our test scores for our students are up. We've got fewer people on welfare. Texas is entrepreneurial heaven. It's a great place to take risks. My policies and my program have been conservative with compassionate results, and that's the kind of president I'm going to be. I want to keep our economy growing by cutting the taxes. I want to be a free trade president so that Iowa farmers can sell their products all across the world. I want to strengthen and save Social Security. I want every child to be educated and not one single child be left behind in this great country. I'm running because I want the American dream to touch every willing heart for people to work hard for it. I don't want people to feel left behind in our country as we head into the 21st century. I'm asking for your vote. God bless you all.
Thank you. Ambassador Keyes.
Well, I guess I really do sometimes become impatient with the euphemisms that we use in this society, because the truth of the matter is, my friends, we're not leaving unborn children behind. We are killing them. And we are killing them in total contravention of the most fundamental principle of this nation's life, that our rights come from God and not from human choice. You can talk, if you like, about budgets and Social Security and every other issue under the sun. But if we don't restore our allegiance to the basic moral principles that this country was founded on, we are going to lose our liberty. And the thing I most dearly want to do is make sure that my children and my grandchildren grow up in a country where they will be free human beings instead of the slaves my ancestors were. And yet in so many ways, because of our lack of moral confidence, we are surrendering the liberties, the Second Amendment rights, the First Amendment rights, the right to make our own choices and decisions in schools and in our own futures. We are surrendering those rights today because we no longer believe that we are the kind of people who morally are capable of sustaining the weight of our rights. We must restore the principles that will give us that confidence, and then we will restore our country to its right path.
Senator McCain.
It's great to be back here in Iowa. I will be on the ballot. I hope that a hearty band of brave souls will go out and vote for me. I would appreciate your support. I'm running for President of the United States because I want to reform government. I want to reform the education system. I want to reform the military, and I want to reform the tax code. I want to get us in tune with this information technology revolution. I can't do that when we have a flawed campaign finance system, the hundreds of thousands of dollar checks that have taken away free speech, that have given the megaphone to the big money people and made you whisper in Washington. The cynicism which borders on alienation amongst young Americans disturbs me. I need to reform the system. We need to give the government back to the people. And then I can inspire a generation to commit themselves to causes greater than their self-interest. I am prepared to be President of the United States. Please join me in this great crusade.
Our thanks to all of the candidates, and our thanks to all of the viewers on MSNBC, and a special thanks to our viewers across the state of Iowa. We hope that tonight's discussion has helped you as you prepare for the caucuses now just 6 weeks away. And a final thanks to Tom Brokaw for coming back to Iowa.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you. Thank you.
Let me just say something that you need to hear this from a reporter. Let me just say that it takes a lot of courage and it takes a lot of energy to run for President of the United States. We all owe all of these men a great debt, as well as the Democrats who are running. It's a personal privilege for me to share this stage not only in Iowa but across the country, because there are few more important things that we'll do in our lifetime than pull the lever for the President of the United States, especially as we enter a new century. There's no piece of software that will do that for us. It requires our personal commitment with our mind and our heart. Your presence here tonight is a great tribute to your commitment as citizens to this process as well. Thank you all very much.
Good night.
Good job.